I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks, the kind of trip where I could get away from the city noise, the endless screens, the deadlines, and just lose myself in the woods. I packed my gear carefully the night before: tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food for 3 days, water filter, flashlight, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and my trusty knife. I made sure everything was in order because I didn't want to be caught unprepared. I wanted to do this right, and to be honest, I was itching for a challenge since it had been a while since I'd been deep into the wilderness by myself. The morning of the trip was clear and crisp. A faint chill was still hanging in the air, the kind that tells you summer is on its way out and fall is creeping in. I loaded my backpack into the car and set off. The drive wasn't too long, about 2 hours from the city, and the closer I got to the forest, the more the trees thickened and the traffic noise faded. I felt that usual swell of excitement mixed with calm as the road turned from pavement to gravel. When I finally parked at the trailhead, I took a moment to look around. There were a few other cars, but not many, which was good. I preferred solitude. The forest here was a mix of tall pines and deciduous trees. The ground was thick with needles and leaves, and the air smelled sharp and clean, with that earthy scent of moss and damp bark. The trail was narrow, winding, and not well marked, perfect for getting lost if you weren't careful. I checked my map and compass again, adjusted my pack, and started walking. First, the hike was easy. The trail went gently uphill, and the sounds of birds and insects filled the air. Every now and then, I spotted a squirrel darting through the underbrush or a woodpecker tapping away at a tree trunk. The sun was warm on my face, and a light breeze rustled the leaves above. It was peaceful, almost soothing, and I settled into a steady rhythm. I kept a steady pace, stopping every now and then to drink water or snap a photo of the scenery. The forest grew thicker and quieter the farther I went, and the trees around me grew older, their bark rough and covered in moss. I noticed the ground was softer here, more damp. Small streams trickled across the trail in places, and I crossed a few narrow wooden bridges that looked a little rickety but still sturdy. By mid-afternoon, I found a small clearing near a creek and decided it was the perfect spot to set up camp. The clearing was flat and surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the fading sunlight but still let enough through to keep it from feeling too dark. The creek babbled softly nearby, its water clear and cold. I knelt on the ground and began unpacking my gear. Setting up the tent took some time, but it went smoothly. I hammered the stakes into the soft earth, pulled the rainfly tight, and made sure the tent was secure. I gathered some dry sticks and branches for a fire, careful to collect only dead wood. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the gentle rush of the creek. After I finished setting up, I sat on a log and ate a simple lunch of trail mix and an apple. I felt a sense of satisfaction, the kind that comes from being self-sufficient. As the day moved toward evening, I prepared to start a fire. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows through the trees and turning the sky shades of orange and purple. I arranged the sticks carefully, added some small twigs and dry leaves, and struck my matches. Took a few tries, but eventually the fire caught. Flames licked up the wood, crackling and popping. The warmth was comforting against the cooling air. I cooked a small meal on my portable stove, a simple pasta with tomato sauce, and ate slowly, savoring the quiet. The forest was darker now, but the fire's glow cast dancing shadows all around. I kept watch over the flames, aware of how quickly the temperature dropped once the sun was gone. I poured some water from the creek through my filter, filling my bottle to have fresh water for the night. I cleaned up and stowed everything away carefully, making sure no scraps were left out to attract animals. The forest had its own rules, and I respected them. I crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent and zipped it up tight, the sounds of the night all around me. The chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, the steady flow of the creek. I felt calm, even though a small part of me was aware of how alone I was in the middle of this vast wilderness. That first night was chilly but peaceful. I slept in fits and starts, waking a few times to adjust my bag or listen to noises outside. At one point, I heard something heavy moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. A branch snapping, the sound of footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I froze, my heart beating faster, but nothing came closer, and after a few tense minutes, the sounds faded away. It was probably a deer or some other animal, but it was enough to remind me that I was a visitor here. Morning came gray and damp with a light drizzle. I unzipped the tent and peered outside. The forest looked different in the wet light, darker and more muted. The creek was swollen from overnight rain, the water moving faster and murkier. I ate a quick breakfast, oatmeal with dried fruit, and packed up camp. The ground was slick, and my boots left deep impressions in the mud. As I started hiking back toward the trailhead, the rain stopped, but the clouds hung low. The forest was quieter, as if holding its breath. The trail was slippery, and I had to watch every step. A few times, I slipped and caught myself on tree roots or rocks. The woods felt less friendly now, colder and more imposing. After about an hour, I noticed something strange. The trail seemed off. The markers I had counted on were missing or obscured by branches. I checked my map and compass again and realized I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. The dense forest around me made it hard to see landmarks, and the light was fading faster than I expected. I tried to stay calm. I retraced my steps a little, looking for the trail markers I knew should be there, but I found nothing. The trees grew thicker, and the ground was uneven and littered with fallen branches. My heart started to pound, not from physical exertion but from growing unease. I was lost. I pulled out my phone, hoping for signal, but there was nothing. No bars, no GPS. I had told myself I'd be prepared for this, but the reality was hitting hard. I felt a prickling in my skin, a mix of cold sweat and adrenaline. The forest suddenly felt vast and unforgiving. I took a deep breath and reminded myself of what I knew about wilderness survival. I checked my supplies, still had food, water, and my flashlight. The sun was sinking behind the trees, and darkness would come soon. I decided to keep moving slowly and carefully, hoping to find the trail or some sign of the way back. Hours passed with no luck. The forest around me felt endless. I started to hear strange sounds, an occasional snap of a branch far off, the distant cry of a bird I couldn't identify, the rustling of leaves. I kept my knife ready, and my flashlight turned on, casting a narrow beam in the growing dark. Every step was cautious. The ground was uneven and my feet ached. By late evening, I found myself near a steep incline. The trees grew closer together, and the forest floor was thick with pine needles and moss. I was tired and hungry, and my mind started racing with worst-case scenarios. I wondered if I should stay put and wait for daylight or keep trying to find the trail. I decided to stay. I found a small patch of relatively flat ground under a large pine tree. I gathered some dry twigs and leaves and managed to start a small fire with my last match. The warmth was immediate, and I sat close to the fire, trying to steady my breathing and calm my mind. The firelight flickered on the trees around me. Shadows stretched and moved with every gust of wind. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crackle of burning wood and distant animal calls. I wrapped myself in my jacket and tried to keep warm. Sleep was impossible, but exhaustion eventually dulled the sharp edges of fear. When dawn finally came, the forest looked different again. Soft light filtering through the mist, the colors muted but peaceful. I felt stiff and sore but somehow relieved. I packed up my fire carefully, made sure no trace was left behind, and began walking again. This time, I moved slower but more methodically. I tried to use the sun's position and the map as best I could. After some time, I noticed fresh tracks on the ground, human footprints. They were recent, and I decided to follow them, hoping they would lead to a trail or campsite. The footprints led me downhill, and after what felt like an eternity, I spotted the edge of the forest. The trees thinned out, and beyond was a dirt road. I walked toward it, heart pounding with relief. I could see a parked car in the distance. People were nearby. I was safe. I walked up to the road and flagged down a passing vehicle. The driver was kind and drove me back to the trailhead. On the way, I explained where I had been lost and how I'd managed to survive the night. They listened carefully, nodded, and offered words of comfort. Back at my car, I sat for a long time, letting the adrenaline drain away. I thought about the forest, the way it was beautiful and dangerous at the same time. The late afternoon sun was fading behind the thick trees when I finally found the perfect spot to set up camp. I had been hiking all day through the dense forest in the northern part of the state, a place I had chosen because it was far away from any trails or crowded areas. I liked the idea of being alone in the wilderness, with nothing but the sound of nature around me. I carried a heavy backpack with all my gear, tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, water, and some food. The ground beneath the trees was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles, and there was a small clearing surrounded by tall evergreens. It looked ideal for pitching a tent. I set up the tent quickly, my hands moving automatically from practice and habit. The fabric smelled fresh, and I was glad I had brought the small LED lantern that didn't rely on fire. It was safer, and after reading some warnings about forest fires, I didn't want to take any chances. As the light slipped away, the forest around me grew darker, and the temperature dropped. I wore a jacket but still felt a chill creeping in. I gathered some dry sticks and small logs for a fire and set up a small cooking area just outside the tent. The smell of the wood burning mixed with the damp earth around me. It was calming, and I sat close to the fire, eating a simple dinner of canned beans heated in a small pot and some bread I had packed. The quiet was heavy but not oppressive. In fact, I enjoyed it. No noise from cars, no other people talking or moving, just the occasional rustling of leaves, the soft calls of distant birds, and the crackle of the fire. After finishing dinner, I laid back inside the tent and pulled out my map to check the route I had planned for tomorrow. The forest was marked with some old logging roads and a few small streams. I wanted to hike to a nearby ridge that promised a good view of the valley below. The map showed no other campsites nearby, which was part of the reason I picked this place. I wanted solitude. The night deepened. The fire was almost out, so I let it burn down while I settled into my sleeping bag. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, moving through the branches above the tent with a soft whistle. I heard the faint sound of twigs snapping far off, maybe some animal moving through the woods. That didn't bother me. I had seen deer and rabbits on the trail earlier in the day. But as I tried to sleep, I noticed a different kind of sound. A repetitive thud, far but steady, coming from deeper in the forest. At first, I thought it might be the wind knocking branches, but the pattern was too regular. It was slow, about once every few seconds, like something hitting a tree or a log. The sound didn't match any animal I knew. I tried to focus on the quiet crackle of the dying fire, but that thudding continued. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and tried to tell myself it was nothing. The forest was full of strange noises at night. Hours passed. The thudding went on, steady and deliberate. I decided to get out of the tent to look around. Feeling the cool air hit my face as I unzipped the tent door. The fire had almost gone cold, so I grabbed my small flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees around the clearing. I scanned slowly, trying to find the source of the sound. First, I saw nothing. Then, about 30 yards away, near the edge of the clearing, I spotted a large tree with bark stripped off in one long vertical patch. It looked fresh. The thudding had stopped for a moment, and the forest was quiet except for my own breathing. I moved closer to the tree and touched the exposed wood. It was rough and raw, as if something had been hitting or clawing at it repeatedly. I shone the flashlight around carefully. Then I noticed more signs, broken branches on the ground, footprints I couldn't identify in the dirt, and large scratches on other trees nearby. They were too big for any animal I had seen before, definitely bigger than a deer or a bear's claws. My heart started to beat faster, but I kept telling myself there was a simple explanation. Maybe some hunters had passed through here, or some construction workers had been cutting trees recently. I went back to the tent and tried to get warm. I added some more sticks to the fire, the flames crackling and giving me a small sense of safety. But the thudding started again, this time closer and louder. It wasn't on a tree anymore. It sounded like something heavy hitting the ground just beyond the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the edge of the camp. The beam scanned the dark forest, but I saw nothing moving. The thudding stopped again. Then, From the corner of my eye, I caught a quick movement between two trees, something dark and large slipping away. I froze, shining the light directly where I had seen it, but nothing was there. The forest was silent again. My mind raced. I considered packing up and leaving right away, but it was already late, and I wasn't sure if I could hike back safely in the dark. I also had no phone signal, and the battery on my GPS was low. I decided to stay, but I kept the fire going bright, sitting close to it with my knife within reach. Time crawled by slowly. Every crack of a twig, every distant animal call made me jump. The night was cold, and I realized I hadn't packed enough warm clothes. I could feel my fingers getting numb. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion was pulling me down. Suddenly, I heard a new sound, heavy footsteps moving quickly through the underbrush just beyond the firelight. They were too heavy and fast to be a deer or any normal animal. My pulse surged. I stood up slowly, holding the flashlight out in front of me, the beam cutting through the darkness. The footsteps stopped right at the edge of the clearing. I could hear breathing now, uneven and loud. Something was out there watching me. I didn't want to see what it was, but I had to know. The beam swept the area, landing on a huge shadow moving between the trees. It was tall and broad like a man, but too big. It didn't move like an animal either. The shadow disappeared quickly, vanishing deeper into the forest. I felt frozen in place, heart pounding in my chest. My mind was racing through every possible explanation. Could it be someone else camping nearby? But why would they hide and act like that? Was it some kind of wild animal? But nothing I knew moved like that. I knew I had to do something. Staying there meant I was vulnerable, but moving through the forest in the dark alone was dangerous. I decided to pack quickly and try to get out the way I came, hoping to make it back before sunrise. I stuffed my gear into my backpack in the dark, careful not to make noise. The fire was dying, so I smashed it out, leaving only a few glowing embers. Then I took one last look around, the flashlight scanning the trees nervously. Step by step, I moved away from the clearing. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows deep and threatening. I tried to keep calm, focusing on the trail I remembered, but I felt like eyes were watching me from every dark corner. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the faint glow of the main logging road. Relief flooded me. I broke into a run, not caring about the rocks and branches cutting my feet. When I reached my car parked near the road, I didn't stop. I threw open the door and got in, locking the doors immediately. I sat there for a long time, breathing hard, the engine running. The forest behind me was dark and quiet again, but I knew something was out there, something big and unknown. I drove away slowly, glancing back at the tree line until the trees disappeared in the distance. When I got home, I checked the news and online forums about the area. Nothing unusual was reported. No missing hikers, no wild animal attacks. Just the usual warnings about bears and coyotes. But I knew what I heard and saw was real. The next day, I returned to the forest with a friend who was an experienced tracker. We examined the marks on the trees and the footprints. They were indeed strange, larger than any bear prints but different in shape. No one could explain them. I never went back to that part of the forest again. I don't know what was out there that night, but I was lucky to get away. I kept camping after that, but always in well-traveled areas near other people. The experience taught me how unpredictable the wild can be and how sometimes the scariest things don't need to be explained by stories or legends. They're just real, raw, dangerous, and waiting in the dark. That night stayed with me, a reminder that some places in the wilderness are best left alone. The forest holds its secrets tightly, and sometimes those secrets walk just beyond the edge of the firelight, watching quietly. I decided to take a short solo camping trip in late October of 2021. It was the kind of decision I made on impulse after scrolling through photos on my phone from a hike I did the year before. I just moved to western Montana after years of living in the city, and even though I had friends here, I was feeling stuck in my head and needed a break. I picked a place called Logan's Pass, not in the national park, but a more remote area that shared the same name with a small roadless basin further west. It wasn't well known, and that was what I liked. I wanted a spot that didn't get a lot of foot traffic. A place where I wouldn't hear other people, car engines, or barking dogs. Just me and the trees, a cold stream, and the sound of my own boots. I packed light but smart. My old green pack from my college days was still in good shape. I brought 2 dehydrated meals, a jet boil, a water filter, a thermal pad, a tent I could set up with trekking poles, and my 0-degree sleeping bag that I hadn't used in over a year. The weather was already changing, and there was frost in the mornings. I also brought a bear canister, even though I wasn't too worried about bears that time of year. It was more for peace of mind than anything else. It took me about 2 hours to drive to the trailhead, most of that on winding dirt roads that passed through lodgepole forest and small ranches. The last few miles were slow. Deep ruts had dried into the dirt, and I had to take it easy in my old Tacoma to keep from bottoming out. I parked at a small pull-off near an unmarked gate that had a faded orange ribbon tied around one of the fence posts. It looked like someone had tried to mark it a long time ago, maybe for hunting season. There were no other vehicles, no other signs of people. Just tall grass, thin pine trees, and the slow, steady sound of wind moving through dry branches. I started hiking a little before noon. The trail was more of an old game path. Not official, just a narrow corridor where brush had been trampled flat over time. I kept checking my GPS to make sure I was heading in the right direction, though it was mostly straightforward. The sun was out, the air was cold, and the silence was the kind that made your ears ring. Every now and then I'd hear the far-off cry of a hawk or a squirrel chattering high up in the trees, but for the most part, it was quiet. Too quiet. I don't mean that in a spooky way, just that I hadn't realized how used to background noise I was until it was gone.
No planes o overhead.
No distant highway, just me and my boots crunching over pine needles and dead leaves. By early afternoon, I reached the basin. It was just as I remembered it from my last visit a couple of years earlier, though the colors were more muted now. Yellow grass, bare aspen trees, and thick stands of fir and pine along the edges. I found a flat spot near the treeline where the ground was soft and clear of big rocks. It took me maybe 15 minutes to set up my tent. Then I walked a little ways to the creek to filter water. The stream was low but running clear, cold as ice when I dipped my fingers in. I filled up 2 bottles and took my time walking back, pausing every now and then to just listen and breathe in the smell of cold dirt and dry leaves. That first night was uneventful. I made a hot meal, some kind of beef stew packet, and sat with my back against a tree watching the light fade. I didn't make a fire. I'd never really liked the smell of smoke in my gear, and I figured I'd be asleep before long anyway. Once it got dark, I crawled into my sleeping bag and lay there listening to the creaks and groans of the forest. The kind of sounds trees make when the temperature drops. Branches moving against one another, ice forming on leaves. It was peaceful, and after a while, I drifted off. At some point in the night, I woke up needing to pee. I checked my watch, it was close to 2 a.m. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. My breath came out in thick clouds, and the cold hit me fast. I walked a little way off, did my business, and turned to head back. That was when I noticed it. There was a trail of disturbed grass running past my tent, curving down toward the creek. It hadn't been there before, and it wasn't from me. It was wide, too wide for a deer trail, and it looked fresh. The grass was still flattened, some of it still springing back up as I watched. I walked over slowly and crouched down, trying to make sense of it. The light from my headlamp bounced off the frost crystals, giving everything a pale shimmer. I couldn't see tracks, exactly, just the path where something had passed through. I told myself it was probably an elk or maybe a black bear. They wandered through these areas all the time, and if it had come by while I was sleeping, it made sense I hadn't heard it. Still, I didn't sleep well after that. I kept thinking I heard something moving outside. Small snapping sounds, a branch falling, footsteps that didn't sound like animal movement. I told myself it was just my imagination, the way your brain reacts when you're alone and can't see more than a few feet past your tent. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I stepped out of the tent and checked around the camp. Nothing looked touched. The bear canister was still closed and in place. My gear was where I left it, and there were no clear tracks in the frost. But that flattened path was still there. Not as crisp, but still visible. I followed it about 50 yards toward the creek, where it disappeared into thicker brush. I poked around a little but didn't find anything. No droppings, no hair. Nothing that would tell me what kind of animal had come through. The whole day felt off after that. I tried to shake the feeling and went for a long hike up one of the ridges to the west. The views were incredible. Snow-dusted peaks in the distance, golden grass rolling down the slopes, clouds hanging low like cotton. But I couldn't focus. Every sound behind me made me stop and turn. At one point I thought I saw movement below me, near the edge of the trees, but when I looked again, there was nothing there, just shadows and light. That night, I kept the tent zipper open a few inches so I could peek out without making noise. I stayed awake way longer than I should have, just watching. The moon was out, bright enough to see without a light, and around 3:30 in the morning, I heard it again. Movement, not fast, not crashing through the brush, just moving, deliberate, slow, like something walking on two legs, pausing, then stepping again. I stayed still. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loud, just listened, came closer. I couldn't see anything from where I was lying, but I could tell it was nearby. Then it stopped. I lay there, frozen, barely blinking. I don't know how long it stayed like that. Maybe a few minutes, maybe longer. But eventually, I heard it walk away. Not quickly, just the same slow steps moving off into the dark. In the morning, there were prints, human prints, barefoot.
Nos shoes.
Just one set, coming from the trees, circling my tent, and then heading off toward the creek again. I followed them a little ways. They were hard to see in some spots, but they were definitely there. No tread, no sole pattern, just long toes, wide heels. The kind of print a person would leave walking barefoot on cold dirt and grass. That's when I packed up. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't stop to rest. I just took down the tent, stuffed everything into my pack, and hiked out. I didn't run, but I moved fast, checking behind me more than I should have. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I didn't feel safe until I saw my truck again, parked in the same quiet pull-off where I'd left it. When I got back home, I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? That someone had walked barefoot into my camp in the middle of the night and just stood there, watching? That they never said anything, never took anything, never made themselves known? That it was October in Montana, freezing cold, and whoever it was left no trace other than their steps. I waited a few days, then I called the county sheriff's office and left a vague message. Said I thought I saw evidence of trespassing up in the Logan's Pass Basin, and maybe they should send someone to check it out. I never heard back. I haven't been back since. I still go camping, still hike, but I stick to more well-known areas now. Places with other people nearby. Not because I'm scared of animals or the cold or getting lost, but because whoever was out there that night wasn't lost. They weren't an animal. They didn't need help. They came into my camp and stood there without saying a word, without making a sound, and then disappeared like nothing happened. That's what stayed with me, not knowing who they were or what they wanted, just knowing that they were out there walking barefoot through the forest in the dead of night, and they found me. It was early June when I decided to go camping alone for a few days. I'd been feeling overwhelmed at work, and the city noise had been getting to me. I live in a noisy part of Tacoma, and lately, even the nights had felt loud. Car alarms, sirens, neighbors yelling, dogs barking. I needed to unplug from everything for a bit. No phone, no traffic, no emails. Just trees, fire, and quiet. I picked a spot about 4 hours southeast, a small, unmarked area just outside of Winlock, in a thick patch of forest between the Chehalis River and a ridge called Maple Line. I found it online through an old hiking forum. A few people had mentioned a flat clearing just past an overgrown access trail that had been used by loggers decades ago. The post was 2 years old, but the coordinates were still there, and from the satellite view, the forest looked untouched. I packed light, a small tent, sleeping bag, water filter, a cooler with dry ice and some basic food, a hunting knife, first aid kit, a lightweight camp stove, and a pair of trail cameras for fun. I had no plans to hunt or fish, just relax, maybe take some notes for a journal I kept but rarely updated. I drove out early on a Thursday, hoping to get there before the afternoon sun dropped. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I was going to be offline in the woods for a couple of days. I figured if I wasn't back by Monday, someone would come looking. The road to the spot was in bad shape. After the first half hour on a dusty, paved forest route, the turnoff became a cracked and narrow dirt road with weeds reaching into the middle. I drove slow, windows down. I could smell the sap and cedar mixing with the earthy smell of moss. Ferns scraped the sides of the car as I crept past them, and I kept checking my GPS as the trail got thinner. I finally stopped when I saw a rotting wooden sign that had fallen off its post, half buried in leaves. The words were unreadable, but it looked like it used to be a marker for some trail or boundary that was close to where the map said to park. I got out, stretched, and listened. The woods were so quiet it actually felt strange at first. No hum of power lines, no distant traffic. Just the soft clicking of insects and the occasional creak of tall trees swaying gently above. The access trail was hard to spot, but I found it. A thin path of trampled grass and leaves, no wider than my shoulders. It disappeared quickly into the forest, winding between tall trees and thick undergrowth. I grabbed my pack, locked the car, and started down the trail. It took me about 25 minutes to reach the clearing. The trail had been steeper than I thought, dropping into a small hollow before climbing back up toward a flat ledge covered in ferns and pine needles. The clearing was there, just like the post had described. A soft oval of dirt and grass about 40 feet across, hemmed in by trees on all sides. The canopy was open enough to let sunlight through, but the place still felt sheltered and private. I set up the tent facing west so I could see the sunset from the flap. I found a good flat rock nearby to use as a seat and made a ring of smaller rocks for a fire pit. I set up my trail cameras on opposite sides of the clearing, more out of habit than anything else. I was used to putting them up when I camped near game trails or creeks, just to see what passed by at night. One camera faced the trail I'd come in from, and the other faced the opposite direction, toward a slope that dipped down into the trees. The first night was peaceful. I made a small fire, ate some warmed-up rice and beans, and sat for hours doing nothing but watching the sky change colors. I saw a few deer tracks near the edge of the clearing, but nothing fresh. When it got dark, I zipped into the tent and fell asleep listening to crickets and the occasional distant rustle. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't a crash or anything sudden. It was steady, a soft scraping like something dragging across dirt and leaves. I stayed still for a few seconds, holding my breath. The sound came from the woods behind the tent, maybe 30 feet away. It went on for maybe 10 seconds and then stopped. I didn't hear anything else. I sat up slowly, unzipped the tent just a little and looked out. Everything was dark. No movement. I listened for several minutes but heard nothing else. It was probably a raccoon or something like that. I lay back down, but I didn't fall asleep for another hour. The next morning, I checked the trail cameras. The one facing the trail I'd used showed nothing but trees moving in the wind. The one facing the slope had a clip from around 2:55 a.m. I played it back and watched a dim shape move through the lower edge of the clearing. It was tall, taller than me, and moving slowly, kinda hunched. No clear outline, just a blurry figure against the black background. It didn't come into the clearing, just passed along the edge. I replayed it 4 or 5 times. Could have been a moose or a bear, maybe, but it moved weirdly, like a person walking with a limp. I didn't delete it. I saved it and tried not to think too much about it. That day, I did a little hiking. I walked up the ridge behind the clearing, climbed a few boulders, and sat for a long time just watching the forest below. I brought a thermos of coffee and my journal, wrote a few paragraphs about the sounds the forest made when it was totally quiet. That creaky, stretching noise that trees make like old floorboards. I kept hearing occasional thumps and distant snaps, but nothing unusual. When I got back to the clearing, I noticed something strange near the trail camera. There was a small pile of rocks near its base, 5 of them stacked neatly. They weren't there the day before. I would have noticed. The rocks were round and flat, maybe river stones, stacked carefully in a small pyramid. I looked around but didn't see anything else disturbed. I picked up the rocks, scattered them, and checked the camera's footage again. Nothing had triggered it during the day. That night, I skipped the fire and cooked inside the tent vestibule. I kept thinking about the shape in the video and the pile of rocks. I convinced myself that maybe someone else had been passing through. Maybe a local hunter or a trail runner. It wasn't illegal to camp here, but it was off the grid. Still, the odds of someone else stumbling on this exact spot the same weekend as me seemed low. I didn't like the idea of someone walking through at night, though. It made me feel exposed. I didn't sleep well that night. Around 1 a.m., I heard the dragging noise again. This time it was closer, maybe 10 feet from the tent. I stayed absolutely still. No flashlight, no movement. I just listened. The sound went on for a while, then stopped. Then I heard something tap against the side of the tent. Just once. A soft bump, like someone lightly poking the fabric with their finger. Then silence again. I didn't unzip the tent. I waited. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to birds chirping and light coming through the mesh. I got out slowly, looking around. There was nothing near the tent, no marks, no prints. The grass was flattened in some spots, but it had been like that before. I checked the camera again. Another night clip. This time the figure came closer. It was walking across the clearing, slow, deliberate steps. It stopped a few times, turning toward the camera but never getting close enough to make out a face or details. It wasn't an animal. The way it moved, arms swinging slightly upright, it was human, but something was off. The proportions seemed strange, like the arms were too long or the head too low. It walked to the tent and stood there for about 20 seconds, then turned and walked back into the trees. I packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't eat, didn't journal, didn't hike. I just wanted to leave. As I rolled up the tent, I found something under the flap. It was another pile of stones, stacked the same way as before. 5 rocks, neat, deliberate. I felt a tight pressure in my chest when I saw them. That was it for me. I put everything in my pack, checked the cameras one last time, and headed back down the trail. The hike back to the car felt twice as long. I kept hearing things behind me. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. But every time I stopped and looked, there was nothing. No movement, no figures, no sounds. I felt watched the whole time. When I finally reached the car, I threw my gear in the back, slammed the door, and drove off without checking my mirrors. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 40 miles north. Back home, I went through the footage again. I downloaded it to my laptop and paused it frame by frame. There were 4 clips total, 2 showing the figure, and 2 where the camera was triggered but nothing was visible. I thought about taking it to the police, but what would I say? Someone walked through a patch of forest I had no legal claim to and stacked rocks? It wasn't a crime. But the more I watched the video, the more I noticed. The figure always stayed just far enough from the camera to stay blurry. It moved slow, but not like it was lost. It moved like it knew where it was going, like it had been there before, and it always left something behind. The last frame of the last video, I hadn't seen it the first few times, showed something just at the edge of the trees, another pile of stones. That was 2 years ago. I haven't gone camping since. I deleted the videos eventually, but sometimes I still see those rocks in my dreams. I took a week off in late September to get away from everything. I've been working nonstop all summer, stuck behind a screen, barely seeing the sun. I wanted something real, something still and quiet and away from the constant buzzing of phones and people and traffic. So I picked a place in the northern part of Michigan, near some state forest land that wasn't too touristy. I didn't want any marked trails or crowded campgrounds. I wanted silence and space and the feeling of being completely alone. I picked out a spot by looking at satellite maps and topographic lines, then packed my gear and drove out early on a Thursday morning. I brought my backpacking tent, a small camp stove, a couple of dehydrated meals, and the usual gear: knife, headlamp, extra batteries, first aid kit, water filter, and so on. I planned to hike in about 6 miles off any major trail, set up near a small lake I spotted on the map, and stay out there for 3 nights. I didn't bring a GPS, just a compass and my laminated maps. I liked doing things the old-fashioned way, and I trusted myself to be careful. The drive took about 5 hours. I left my car at a small gravel parking area that was barely marked and started hiking a little before noon. The air was cool and damp, and the trees were just starting to turn. Some of the maples had lit up bright orange and red, but most of the forest was still green, with just the tips changing. It was beautiful. The trail I started on was narrow and barely used, and after a couple miles, I left it entirely, cutting west through thick woods using the compass. I moved slowly and kept track of the landmarks. 2 big granite outcroppings, a dried-up creek bed, a small marsh that buzzed with insects. The forest was dense but peaceful, and I didn't see another person or even a sign of one. Just deer scat, the occasional rabbit trail, and a few woodpecker holes in the trees. By 4:30, I reached the lake. It was even better than I expected, about the size of a football field, almost perfectly round, with a ring of reeds and lilies near the edges. There was no sign of people, no fire rings, no garbage, no old fishing lines caught on branches. I picked a flat spot about 30 yards back from the water, cleared it, and set up my tent. Then I made a quick dinner, filtered some water, and watched the light go down over the trees. The sky turned pink, then purple, and then the stars came out. I felt calm in a way I hadn't felt in months. That first night was peaceful. I woke up once to pee, around 2 a.m., and stepped outside the tent. The moon had risen, and it cast a pale silver light over the lake. It was completely still, no wind, no sounds except the distant hoot of an owl. I stood there a while, breathing it in, then went back inside and slept until morning. The second day was colder. I made coffee over my little stove, ate a granola bar, then spent the day exploring the area. I walked around the entire lake, noting animal prints near the shore. Deer, raccoon, maybe a coyote. I hiked a couple miles outward in each direction, just seeing what was around. The terrain was rocky in some places, steep in others, with a few narrow gullies and thick patches of young trees. I saw a few more signs of wildlife, some fresh scat that looked like it belonged to a bear, and scratches on a tree that were old but still noticeable. I didn't see or hear anything that made me nervous, but I made a mental note to cook and store food carefully. That night, I set up a bear bag and hung it about 20 yards from my tent, high up on a thick branch. I had a second small dry bag that I used for snacks, and I kept that with me inside the tent, which I knew wasn't perfect practice, but I figured a few sealed protein bars wouldn't attract anything if I was careful. That night, I heard something walking near my tent. It was around midnight. I had just dozed off when I heard a distinct crunch in the leaves, maybe 20 feet away. I froze, listening. It was a slow, deliberate step, then a pause, then another step. Not a squirrel or rabbit. Too heavy. Not a deer either. They move quicker and with a different kind of rhythm. This was slow. 1, 2, pause. Then another crunch. I stayed perfectly still. I didn't want to make noise or shine a light unless I had to. After about a minute, the sounds faded. Whatever it was had walked away. I waited another 10 minutes, barely breathing, before I turned on my headlamp. I didn't see anything through the tent walls. No shapes, no eyes reflecting back at me. I stayed up another half hour, then finally managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, I walked around the camp. I didn't see any tracks. The leaves were dry, and nothing left a clear mark. My bear bag was untouched. Everything seemed normal. Still, the sound stuck with me. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or porcupine, something slow-moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been closer to the tent than I liked. I went about my day as planned, but I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound, the creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me pause. I felt watched, though I never saw anything. That afternoon, I hiked east for a bit and found a small rock ridge with a nice view of the forest below. I sat there for a long time, thinking about nothing, letting the wind pass through me. Then I headed back before it got dark. That night, I double-checked everything. My bear bag was hung higher and farther. I kept my knife next to my sleeping bag. I left the tent zipper halfway open in case I needed to get out quickly. I didn't light a fire. I figured less smell and light was better. I laid there for an hour in the dark, listening. The forest was quiet at first. Then the wind picked up slightly, and I heard the branches sway. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they circled the tent. I'm not exaggerating. I lay there frozen as I heard one slow crunch after another, moving in a wide circle, maybe 20 feet out, then 15, then closer. It was methodical. It stopped for long stretches like it was listening. Then it would move again. At one point it sounded like it stepped on a stick. It cracked loudly and then everything went quiet. I stayed completely still. My breathing was shallow, and I could feel sweat running down my sides even though it was cold. My heart pounded so loud I was afraid it would be heard outside the tent. I never looked. I never unzipped the tent. I didn't want to see what was there. After about 30 minutes of silence, I finally heard it walk away. Same slow, careful steps. Crunch, pause, crunch, then nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I just laid there until the sky started turning light. At first light, I got out of the tent and looked around. There were tracks this time. Human ones. Bare feet. They weren't large, maybe a size 10, but they were clearly barefoot. You could see the heel, the arch, and the toes. They came in from the woods, circled the tent, then led off again into the trees. No boots, no shoes. No sign of clothing or gear. Just bare feet in the cold morning leaves. My stomach turned. I packed everything in less than 15 minutes. Tent, gear, stove, food. All of it went into my pack in a rush. I didn't eat, didn't even brush my teeth. I just wanted to get the hell out. I didn't follow my usual compass route. I just moved fast in the general direction of the car. I got lost twice. My legs shook as I moved through thick brush and climbed over rocks and fallen logs. I turned my ankle once but kept going. I didn't stop until I hit the old trail, then followed it back to the parking area. When I finally saw my car, I almost started crying. There was something written in the dirt on the back windshield. A finger had traced 3 words in the dust. You were watched. I don't know how long I stood there before getting in and locking the doors. I didn't even check if anything was missing or damaged. I just turned the engine over and drove. I never reported it. What could I say? That I heard footsteps and saw bare feet in the woods? That someone had silently walked around my tent in the dark? Twice? That they wrote something in the dirt? There was no law against that, technically. No proof of a crime. Just signs. Just warnings. I haven't been camping alone since. I still hike, but I stick to day trips and public trails. I still love the forest, the quiet, the wind in the trees. But I know now that being alone in the woods doesn't mean you're really alone. And if someone wants to scare you without ever showing their face, they can. They don't need to speak. They don't need to touch anything. They just need to let you know, gently, quietly, patiently, that they're there, watching, listening, waiting, and that's enough. I was 32 when I took a solo camping trip that I still think about every time I pack a bag, even for a weekend hike. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a quiet break from work and noise. I picked a remote spot in Central Oregon, not too far from where I used to hike as a teenager. I chose it because it was far enough from cities that I wouldn't hear cars, and it had a good mix of forest and river with some open fields for camping. I planned for 4 days, brought my gear, packed extra supplies, even printed maps just in case I lost cell service. I left my phone on airplane mode to save the battery. The first day went like most camping trips I'd done before. I drove about 3 hours, turned off onto a gravel road, and followed it until it narrowed into a dirt track. There weren't any other cars out there, which was perfect. I parked just inside a clearing where the forest opened up a little. I walked about 2 miles in before picking a spot near a low hill, close enough to hear the river if I listened. I set up my tent under a tall pine, spread out my gear, and built a small fire ring out of rocks. The air smelled clean, like dried pine needles and wet earth. I didn't hear anything but wind in the trees and the occasional bird. It was peaceful. I cooked a quick dinner, sat by the fire until dark, then climbed into my sleeping bag and listened to the forest breathe around me until I fell asleep. The second day, I woke up early, just as the sky turned blue. It was cold and a little damp, so I boiled water for coffee and sat wrapped in my sleeping bag while the sun crept over the trees. I spent the morning exploring up the hill behind my tent. The ground rose steadily and then leveled out into a rocky ridge. From up there, I could see the river glinting through the trees. Everything looked untouched.
No trash, no trals.
I took a few pictures with my phone, then headed back to camp around noon. I spent the rest of the afternoon reading and cooking and just letting my mind go quiet. By sunset, I was ready to sleep again, and I drifted off fast. It was the third day when things started to shift. I woke up around 3 a.m., cold and needing to pee. The fire had long since died down, and the air had that kind of stillness that makes every sound sharper. I got out of my tent with a flashlight and walked a few feet into the woods. As I was walking back, I paused for a second. I didn't know why, but something felt off. Not a sound or a shape, just a tension in the air, like the quiet was too quiet. I stood still and listened hard, sweeping the flashlight around. Nothing, just trees, shadows, the crunch of pine needles under my boots. But I felt it, that feeling you get when someone's watching you from across a room, even if they're not moving. I forced myself to laugh it off, told myself I was being paranoid, and climbed back into the tent. When I woke up later that morning, I noticed something strange. A small pile of rocks had been stacked near my tent, about 5 feet from the entrance. Just 4 or 5 stones in a neat column, maybe 10 inches high. It wasn't there the day before. I knew that for sure. I stared at it for a while, trying to figure out what to make of it. Animals couldn't stack rocks, and there weren't any signs of other people. No boot prints, no broken branches, no food stolen. Nothing was touched at the site. My bag was sealed. My knife and bear spray were where I left them. It was just this little tower of rocks. I kicked it over and walked the perimeter of my camp twice. I didn't find anything. I convinced myself maybe it had been there and I hadn't noticed. I wasn't sure anymore. I tried to shake it off, went for a hike down to the river to distract myself. I fished a little, sat in the sun, then made my way back in the early evening. That night, I barely slept. Every sound felt like it was a little closer to me. Cracking branches, wind moving through dry leaves, faint sounds like shuffling. I kept checking the zipper of the tent, checking the knife next to my sleeping bag. I didn't use my light because I didn't want to draw attention. I just lay there staring into the dark, waiting. By morning, I was exhausted. I stepped out of the tent and immediately saw what had changed. My camp chair was gone. It had been folded and leaned up against a tree the night before, and now it was gone. I searched everywhere. I looked behind the tent, in the trees, by the fire ring, even down the trail a bit. It wasn't just knocked over. It was completely gone. I didn't hear anything during the night. Nothing that sounded like someone walking into camp. And again, no footprints.
No trash disturb.
Just the chair vanished. I decided I wasn't going to wait and see what else went missing. I started packing. I moved fast, but I kept stopping to check behind me. I didn't feel like I was alone anymore. Every tree felt like it had eyes. I took down the tent, stuffed everything into my pack, and started walking back to the car. It was about 2 miles, but it felt longer. I walked fast, trying not to run. The forest was completely quiet again. No birds, no bugs, just the sound of my boots. When I reached the spot where I'd parked, I stopped dead. My car was still there, but the driver's side door was wide open. I know I locked it. I always lock it, especially out in the middle of nowhere. My stomach dropped. I stood there staring at it, then slowly walked forward, keeping my eyes on the tree line. I looked inside the car. The seats were untouched. My phone charger was still in the port. My extra food in the back seat was untouched. I checked the trunk. Nothing missing. No damage. No sign of forced entry. Just the door hanging open. I climbed in, started the car, and drove. I didn't stop for anything. I drove the entire way home without turning on the radio. my hands tight on the wheel. I didn't even want to think about what had happened until I was safely in my apartment, with the door locked and the blinds drawn. Over the next few days, I tried to come up with explanations. Maybe a hunter had been nearby, and I just never saw them. Maybe someone was messing with me or had been squatting out there and got territorial. But none of it made sense. Who would walk into someone's camp, not take anything, not leave a mark except for a rock pile and a missing chair? Why leave the car untouched, but open the door? I kept thinking about that rock pile. It felt like some kind of message, even if I couldn't understand it. Not a warning exactly, but a sign. Like someone was letting me know they'd been there, that they could come closer if they wanted to. And they did. That trip changed how I see the woods. I still hike. I still camp sometimes, but never alone anymore. I bring extra gear now, trail cameras, a backup GPS, even a satellite phone on longer trips. But more than that, I listen harder. I pay attention to the small things, rocks, sticks, footprints. And if I ever see something I know I didn't leave, I don't question it anymore. I leave. That was the last time I went completely off-grid by myself. I haven't been back to that part of Oregon since. Maybe someone was living out there, completely off the map. Maybe more than one person. I'll never know for sure, but I think about the stillness of that night, the way the air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. I think about how quiet everything was, and how carefully they moved. No broken branches, no signs of struggle, just the chair gone, and the door left open, like an invitation, or a warning. It was late August in 2021 when I decided to take a few days off and camp alone in a remote part of Idaho I had never been to before. I had found a few spots on satellite maps that looked promising: thick forest, a small river nearby, no real trails leading in, and far from any town. I had no real goal except to be off-grid, clear my head, and spend some time alone in nature. I had done solo camping a handful of times before, but always in more familiar places or at least within a few miles of a known trail. This time, I wanted to be completely alone, just me and the woods. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, freeze-dried meals, a water filter, bear spray, flashlight, backup batteries, fire starter, hatchet, knife, small pot and pan, extra clothes, first aid kit. I brought my GPS and a printed topographical map. I knew the weather could swing quickly out there, especially at that time of year, so I packed for cold and rain, even though the forecast showed mostly clear skies. I also let my brother know the coordinates where I planned to set up camp and told him I'd check in by text when I got back to my truck 3 days later. The drive took most of the morning. I had to leave paved roads after a while and follow a dusty logging road that cut through empty stretches of forest. There weren't any signs or markers except for old paint on tree trunks that probably meant something to logging crews. After a while, I parked my truck in a small clearing just off a sharp bend in the road. I locked it up, strapped on my pack, and started hiking west into the woods. The first few miles weren't too hard. The terrain was uneven and rocky in some places, but I had a good sense of direction, and I kept checking my position against the map and GPS. I crossed 2 shallow creeks and followed a game trail for a little while until it disappeared. The forest was thick with spruce and pine, and the ground was carpeted with dry needles. No signs of other people. No beer cans, no fire pits, no old footprints. It felt exactly how I hoped it would. Untouched, quiet, peaceful. Just birds, wind, and the distant rush of water. By the late afternoon, I found a spot that looked perfect. It was a small flat area tucked between a slope and a bend in the river. The river was maybe 15 feet wide, slow-moving and clear. There were animal tracks near the water, mostly deer, but I didn't see anything fresh or alarming. I set up my tent on the high side of the clearing, away from the water. I got a small fire going with dry branches and cooked one of the freeze-dried meals. I ate while sitting on a big moss-covered rock, facing the river. The light faded slowly behind the trees. I felt relaxed and calm. That first night went by without any problems. I woke up once around 2 a.m. because something rustled outside the tent, but it sounded like a small animal, probably a raccoon or a fox. I stayed still and listened for a while, but it didn't last long. I fell asleep again and woke up with the sun shining through the tent fabric. I spent the second day exploring. I hiked upstream for a while, looking for good fishing spots even though I hadn't brought a rod. I made notes in my journal. I found a patch of wild berries, but most were too sour to eat. I filled up my water bottles from the river using the filter. I cooked again over the fire, took some photos, carved at a piece of wood with my knife. Nothing remarkable happened. I felt a little lonely, but not in a bad way. I liked the quiet. That night, things changed. It started with the feeling that I was being watched. I know how cliché that sounds, but that's the only way I can describe it. I was sitting by the fire, just past sunset. The flames flickered, and the woods around me were growing darker by the minute. I had just finished eating and was boiling a little water when I suddenly felt exposed, like someone was standing just beyond the tree line. I turned slowly and looked around, shining my flashlight out into the woods. The beam lit up the trunks and the undergrowth, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sound. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was spooked because I hadn't seen or heard another person in 2 days. I turned back toward the fire and kept it going until the water boiled. I made tea and tried to push the weird feeling away. Later that night, I woke up suddenly. Not because of a noise, but because of the silence. The forest is never completely quiet, not really. Even at night, there are insects, owls, the sound of wind in the branches. But when I woke up, everything was still. Not a single chirp or rustle, just dead silence. That's what made it feel wrong. I lay there on my back, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent, listening. I waited for the sound of some small animal moving in the underbrush, or the wind, or the river. I couldn't hear the river anymore either, which didn't make sense, because I was camped right above it. The tent wasn't soundproof. I sat up slowly and unzipped the tent door just enough to peek out. The fire was long out. The moon was out, but it was behind clouds, so the woods were dark. I stayed still, listening, until I thought I heard something in the trees. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunch of pine needles. Then another, then silence again. I thought about grabbing the bear spray or my hatchet, but I didn't move. I just kept listening. I heard another soft crunch, closer than before, but then nothing for a long time. Eventually, the sounds stopped. I sat there for over an hour, probably more, until the wind picked up again, and the normal nighttime noises came back. Crickets, distant owls. I felt like I could finally breathe again. I closed the flap and lay back down, but I didn't fall asleep for a long time. The next morning, I walked the area around my campsite. I looked for tracks, signs of animals, anything out of place. I found nothing. No footprints, no claw marks, nothing broken or moved. But the feeling from the night before stuck with me. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but I was. Something about it didn't sit right. It wasn't just nerves. I've had nights alone in the woods before where I got spooked, but this was different. Still, I didn't pack up. I told myself I'd finish out the last night, then head back to the truck in the morning. I didn't want to feel like I'd let my imagination chase me out. That day passed slowly. I didn't wander far from the site. I kept the fire going longer than usual. I sharpened my knife. I stacked some logs nearby. I even built a little barrier of sticks and branches around the back of my tent. Not because I thought it would stop anything, but because it gave me something to do. That night, I lay in the tent with the hatchet beside me and the bear spray within reach. I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard the same slow crunching of pine needles, just like the night before. This time I didn't peek out. I just held still, breathing as quietly as I could. The sound came closer, then stopped. Then it started again, moving slowly along the edge of the clearing. Something or someone was circling the tent. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Eventually, it stopped completely. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. No movement. I unzipped the flap as quietly as I could and shined my flashlight toward the tree line. Nothing. I stepped out slowly, turning the light in a full circle. No eyes reflecting the beam. No shadows. No signs of anything. I checked the fire pit, my gear, the path to the river. Nothing had been touched. but I noticed something strange in the dirt about 20 feet from the tent. It was a small depression in the pine needles, like someone had stepped there and shifted their weight. It didn't look like a deer print. It looked more like a boot tread, but only part of it was visible. I crouched and looked closer. Definitely not an animal. The pine needles were disturbed in a way that suggested slow, careful movement, like whoever made it was trying not to be heard. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat with my back to a tree until the sky started to lighten. As soon as there was enough daylight, I packed up camp in silence. I didn't make breakfast, didn't take notes, didn't even stop to fold the tent properly. I just shoved everything into the pack and started hiking back to the truck. The hike back felt longer than it had coming in. I kept looking over my shoulder, listening for footsteps. I stopped several times and crouched in the brush just to listen. I didn't hear anything following me, but that didn't make me feel better. It just made me more anxious, like whoever or whatever it was had already left or knew how to stay hidden. I didn't feel alone. When I finally reached my truck, the relief hit me like a wave. I checked it all over. No signs anyone had touched it. I got in and locked the doors right away, then sat there for a while before starting it up. When I drove back down the logging road, I kept checking the rearview mirror the whole time. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not even my brother. I didn't want to sound paranoid or crazy, but I know what I heard out there. I know how it felt. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't wind. Someone was out there, watching my camp, walking the edge of the clearing in the middle of the night. Twice. A few months later, out of curiosity, I went online and searched the coordinates I had written down from that trip. I didn't find much, but I came across a forum post. I decided to take a short camping trip by myself at the end of September, just before the fall colors really set in. I'd been working too much, sitting in front of a screen every day, and I just needed to feel something natural again. Dirt under my boots, wind in the trees, something that reminded me life wasn't just emails and car horns. I picked a lesser-known spot in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, a small inland lake that didn't even have a name on most maps. It was quiet, tucked back a couple of miles off a gravel road, and there were no campsites, just flat ground and tall pines. I packed light, but enough to stay warm at night. Sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees, foam pad, small tent, a hand axe, a headlamp, plenty of batteries, and enough food to last me 3 days. I brought a water filter, too, since I planned to take water straight from the lake. My cell service dropped out about 10 minutes after turning off the highway, and I didn't expect to see it again until I left. The walk from where I parked to the lake wasn't difficult. Just a dirt path through tall grass and trees, with some animal trails crossing through. I saw deer tracks, maybe coyote too, but nothing unusual. The forest was quiet, peaceful. Just the sound of wind high up in the trees and the occasional bird calling out. I reached the lake before noon. It was beautiful, absolutely still, with the kind of water that looked like black glass when there was no wind. No docks, no boats, no signs anyone had camped here recently. I picked a flat spot a little up from the shore, under a stand of birch trees. I set up the tent, gathered firewood, and started boiling water for coffee. The whole afternoon passed like that, slow and calm. I made dinner before it got dark, packed up all the food into a bear bag, and hung it high in a tree maybe 30 yards from camp. Then I sat by the fire and let my mind relax for the first time in what felt like months. That first night was uneventful. It dipped into the 40s, but I stayed warm enough in my bag. I heard a few rustles outside the tent, but that's just normal for the woods. Raccoons, maybe a porcupine or a fox moving through. I didn't think much of it and fell back asleep each time. The second day started off just like the first. I woke up early, ate oatmeal, and spent most of the morning just walking around the lake, not really with any plan. There were no trails, so I had to bushwhack a bit, but the woods were open enough to make that easy. I saw a couple of beaver dams on the far side, and a lot of trees chewed through. Some big tracks in the mud, too. Could have been moose or a big deer. Still nothing strange, just typical northern woods. Around mid-afternoon, I was back at my camp, sitting by the water and skipping stones when I noticed something across the lake. It was far, probably a couple hundred yards away, almost directly opposite from me. At first, I thought it was just a big stump sticking out from the trees, but then it moved. Just a little shift, like a person leaning sideways behind a tree. I stared at it for a while, trying to decide what I was looking at. But after a few seconds, nothing else moved. I squinted at it, but the sun was behind it and the glare off the water made it hard to see. Eventually, I just decided it was a trick of the light or a tree swaying in the wind. I tried not to let it bug me. Later, I boiled water for dinner and watched the sun drop below the trees. That night, I stayed up a little later by the fire. The woods were dead silent. Not eerie, just the kind of quiet that presses in on you, like your own breathing is the loudest thing in the world. I turned in around 10. The fire was still glowing when I zipped up the tent. I woke up in the middle of the night, not sure what time it was. Felt like just after midnight. Something had snapped me awake. I laid still, listening. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then I caught it. Twigs cracking. Slow, careful steps somewhere behind the tent. The kind of sound someone makes when they're trying not to be heard but still step on something dry. My first thought was a bear, but I remembered the bag was hung far from camp, and I hadn't brought any food into the tent. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, listening. The steps circled. Not fast, not heavy like an animal. They moved to the side of the tent, then toward the front, then silence. I reached slowly to my side for the axe I kept next to the sleeping bag. My hand wrapped around the handle and just stayed there. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't breathe too deep. I just listened, but whatever it was had stopped moving. After a long while, I finally heard steps again, this time moving away. They faded out, no big crashing or rustling, just gone. I laid there for what felt like an hour before I dozed off again. By morning, I wasn't even sure it had happened. Maybe a dream, maybe a deer, but I still checked around the tent. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, not the kind that hold clear tracks. I didn't find anything, no scuff marks, no footprints. I went and checked my bear bag, still hanging, untouched. I tried to brush it off and go about my day. I made breakfast, boiled water, and told myself it was just the usual night noises playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching the camp. I couldn't see anyone across the lake that morning, and I scanned the shoreline for a long time. Nothing, no movement. The water was calm. The wind was soft, but something still felt off. I took a walk again, this time staying closer to my side of the lake, maybe a mile out and back. I didn't go far. I just didn't feel like leaving the camp out of sight. When I came back, everything was how I left it, but that sense of unease stuck with me. That night, I didn't build a fire. I cooked early and doused the coals. I figured if someone had been near camp the night before, I didn't want to give them a glowing marker to find me again. I packed everything tight and kept the axe right beside me like the night before. Again, I woke up just after midnight. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of something touching the tent. A brush, like fingers dragging lightly across the fabric. I froze, heart pounding, and grabbed the axe handle. The noise moved along the wall of the tent, slowly, not an animal pawing or sniffing. This was more careful, like someone pressing on the side gently. My skin went cold. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I waited, counting my breaths in my head. After a minute, it stopped. No more dragging, no steps, just stillness. Eventually, I whispered to myself, "Go, just go." I unzipped the tent in one slow motion, axe in hand, and stepped out barefoot into the cold dirt. My headlamp was around my neck. I turned it on and shined the beam around. There was nothing. The woods were still. The lake was like glass. Not a sound, not a flicker of movement. My breath looked white in the beam of the light. I walked slowly around the tent. Nothing, no signs. I scanned the trees. Nothing moved. I even walked to where I'd hung the bear bag. Still there, untouched. But I knew something had been near me. I wasn't making it up. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting on a rock with my axe and light, just watching the woods. By morning, I had decided to leave. I packed up fast, took down the tent, rolled my bag, stuffed everything into my pack. I didn't eat. I didn't make coffee. I just drank cold water and chewed a granola bar while I walked. I was maybe half a mile down the path when I found something that stopped me. Right in the middle of the trail, half buried in dirt, was a footprint. A boot print, not mine. It was wider and longer, pointed straight toward where my camp had been. There were other faint ones behind it, but that one was clearest. The dirt wasn't soft, but it was enough to leave a faint mark if you stepped just right. That's when I knew someone had been out there with me. Not a ranger, not a hunter. No one would come that close to a tent in the middle of the night if they were just passing through. They'd say something, make noise, keep their distance. This person hadn't done that. I kept walking, faster. I didn't stop for water. I didn't stop to rest. I made it back to my car in less than an hour, which was fast for that terrain. I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors as soon as I got in. I didn't even check my phone until I was back on the highway. It took me a few days to really settle back into normal life. I didn't tell anyone. Not right away. What could I say? Some guy watched my camp and dragged his hand across my tent? I had no photo, no name, just a print in the dirt and the sound of steps at night. Weeks later, I went on a hiking forum and looked up posts about the area. Buried in the comments of an old thread, someone mentioned hearing footsteps around their camp near that same lake 2 years earlier. Said it felt like someone was just out of view all night. They left the next morning and never went back. No one replied to the comment. I haven't camped alone since. Not because I'm scared of the woods. I still hike. I still love the trees and the silence. But I don't like the idea of someone out there who doesn't announce themselves, who watches, who circles your tent and never speaks. There are things out there worse than wolves or bears. Things with 2 legs and bad intentions. And the worst part is you never really... I drove out to the mountains in early October, just before the air turned too cold for tent camping, but after the summer crowds had cleared out. I needed the break. Work had been a grind lately, and everything in the city felt loud and close and tense. I didn't want to talk to anyone, hear anything, or even think much. I just wanted to set up camp somewhere quiet, hike during the day, and sleep early with nothing but the wind and the trees outside my tent. The area I picked wasn't some remote wilderness deep in Alaska or anything, just a couple hours outside Boise, Idaho. I found a small national forest campground online that didn't require reservations and was usually empty that time of year. I figured if it was too crowded, I'd just drive further and do some dispersed camping. But when I got there, only 2 other sites were taken, and they were far apart. Perfect. The road to the campground was paved for a while, then turned to gravel. It curved through patches of dense pine trees, opened up briefly along a dry creek bed, then dipped into a valley. The sun was low by the time I arrived, maybe an hour or 2 before sunset. The site I picked was at the far end, away from the pit toilets and other cars. It had a picnic table, a fire ring, and a flat spot for my tent under some tall lodgepole pines. I didn't waste time setting up. I got the tent pitched, sleeping bag unrolled, and camp stove out fast. I boiled water for a freeze-dried meal, ate while sitting on the table bench, then cleaned everything up before dark. It dropped colder than I expected as soon as the sun dipped behind the ridge, and by 8 o'clock, I was already zipped into my sleeping bag. The first night was peaceful. There were a few sounds from the woods, wind in the trees, distant snapping branches, but nothing strange or alarming. I woke once around 2 a.m. to pee and stood for a moment outside the tent. The stars were brutally clear, the kind you only see miles from anything. I didn't even need a flashlight. The moon was out, casting pale blue light through the pines. It was dead silent. The next morning, I took my time with coffee and oatmeal, then packed a small day pack and set out on one of the nearby trails. It climbed gradually up the slope behind the campground, looping through burned-out patches from a fire years ago, then into thick forest. I passed no one all day, not a single hiker. Felt like the whole mountain was mine. By mid-afternoon, I was back at my campsite. I spent an hour gathering dry wood and stacking it by the fire ring, then built a small fire to cook dinner and keep warm. That night was colder. I could see my breath even with the fire going. I layered up, pulled my hat low over my ears, and stayed up a bit longer than the first night, watching the fire burn down to coals. But that second night, I woke up twice. The first time was probably around midnight. I wasn't sure what woke me. Maybe a dream, maybe some distant noise, but I lay still for a while, heart beating faster than it should have been. I unzipped the sleeping bag slowly and sat up, listening. There was nothing. No footsteps, no twigs snapping, not even wind. The second time I woke, it was still dark. I checked my watch, 3:41 a.m. This time I was sure I'd heard something. A low crunch like a boot on dry needles. I held my breath and listened. It didn't come again. I considered getting out and shining my flashlight around, but the cold held me in place. After 10 minutes, I talked myself down. Probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon nosing around. I eventually drifted back off, but not deeply. The next day, I told myself I'd hike less and stay near camp. I figured I might just be on edge because I wasn't used to being alone like this for so long. Most of the time, you never get true silence in life. There's always something humming or talking or moving around. But here, it was just me and nature, and I wasn't sure my brain was ready for it. Around noon, I decided to walk down the gravel road to the creek bed I passed on the way in. I brought my camp chair and sat by the dry rocks for about an hour, just listening to the breeze. A few crows passed overhead. A squirrel barked at me from a nearby branch. Still no other people, no vehicles, nothing. When I returned to camp later that afternoon, something small caught my attention. My tent zipper was about 6 inches down from where I'd left it. It wasn't wide open, and I couldn't remember exactly if I'd closed it all the way earlier, but it stood out. I checked the tent inside. Nothing seemed disturbed. My sleeping bag was still zipped. My gear was all there. It was probably just me, I told myself. I probably left it that way. But that night, I barely slept. It wasn't just the cold, though that didn't help. It was the creeping feeling that someone might be nearby. Not something, someone. I kept thinking about that zipper. Kept thinking about the way I thought I'd heard a footstep outside the night before. I stayed awake most of the night, drifting in and out of shallow sleep, then snapping awake at the tiniest sounds. I heard movement a couple times, but each time I sat up and waited, nothing followed. No more steps, no voices, no shapes, just silence again. I made it until dawn, packed up my stove, and told myself I'd head out after one last hike. I didn't want to cut my trip short over nothing. That morning, I followed a different trail that looped north and wrapped back toward the ridge above the campground. It was less maintained, with more overgrowth, but still easy to follow. About 45 minutes up the trail, I noticed something strange. A piece of blue nylon, maybe 5 or 6 inches across, caught on a branch. It looked like it had been ripped from a tarp or backpack. Nothing weird about that alone, but it was recent, not weathered or faded. I looked around for more, found nothing. I kept going. Not much further along, maybe another 20 minutes, I found the fire pit. Not a ring like the campground ones. This was a small, crude circle of blackened rocks off-trail. Nearby were broken branches and boot prints in the dirt. Someone had camped there recently, but not cleanly. There were cigarette butts, a crumpled beer can, and part of a blanket balled up under a log. Something about it made my chest tighten. Not because it was messy, but because it felt wrong. Like whoever had been here hadn't left willingly, or wasn't planning on being found. I stood still for a long time, looking around. No one else. No gear left behind except that blanket and the trash. I turned and walked back the way I came, a little faster now. That night, my last night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed zipped up in my tent, knife within arm's reach. I left my boots on and my flashlight under my pillow. Around midnight, I heard movement again. This time I knew I wasn't imagining it. There were slow, deliberate steps outside my tent. They crunched softly, stopped, then resumed. They circled. Whoever it was never spoke, never touched the tent. But they stayed out there, just beyond the thin nylon wall, for over half an hour. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just lay there, heart hammering, gripping the handle of my knife and waiting for the zipper to move. It never did. Eventually, the footsteps faded. When the sky lightened slightly around 5, I packed everything as fast and quietly as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even boil water. I shoved my sleeping bag into the pack, broke down the tent in record time, and threw everything into the back of my car without caring how it was arranged. The moment the engine turned over, I pulled out of that campsite and didn't look back. As I drove down the gravel road, I saw fresh boot prints in the dust. Not mine. The treads didn't match my boots. They led across the road and into the woods on the opposite side of where my tent had been. I drove all the way back to the city without stopping. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a long time. Not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because there was nothing really to tell. No crime, no confrontation, no injury, nothing concrete. Just the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone out there, that someone else had been camping nearby watching. Weeks later, I read about a guy who'd been arrested in that same national forest not far from the campground. He'd been living off-grid, stealing from campers, breaking into tents while people hiked, and sometimes just standing outside campsites at night watching. No one had been seriously hurt, but the reports were unsettling. He'd apparently been doing it for months before someone caught him trying to break into a truck. I don't know if it was him outside my tent that night. I'll never know for sure. But after reading that, I stopped camping alone. Not because I was scared of the woods, but because the scariest thing out there wasn't the forest. It was the people hiding in it. It was early June when I decided to take a short break from work. I'd been sitting in front of a computer screen for months, barely seeing daylight, barely hearing anything other than the sound of my own typing. I wasn't sleeping much. My back hurt from the office chair, and my head felt heavy all the time. I didn't want to waste my vacation days sitting around my apartment in the city, so I planned a 3-day solo camping trip. Nothing fancy, just me, a tent, and some fresh air. I'd done a few solo hikes before, but never stayed out in the woods overnight by myself. I figured it would do me some good. I picked a spot in the northern part of Oregon, about a 5-hour drive from where I lived. The place wasn't too popular, not completely off the map either, just a forested area near a small lake, surrounded by old pine trees and rough dirt trails. The day I left, I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, some food, water, a knife, flashlight, extra batteries, first aid kit, matches, and a small camping stove. I didn't bring a phone charger since I planned to shut my phone off and disconnect. Felt like the right thing to do. I double-checked everything, filled up my gas tank, and left early enough to make it to the trailhead by early afternoon. The road was mostly empty, just long stretches of 2-lane roads winding between farms, small towns, and patches of thick forest. I made good time, pulled into the gravel parking area by the trail around 1:30 p.m. and saw just one other car there, a dusty old sedan. Nothing strange about that. The trail wasn't marked by any official signs, but I'd done my research. The path was visible and I had a printed map along with a compass just in case. The air smelled of pine and damp leaves. There was a coolness in the shade, even though the sun was out. I started walking, following the winding trail deeper into the forest. I planned to hike about 3 miles to a small clearing by the lake where other campers had stayed before. The trail wasn't tough, but the silence felt heavier the farther I went. At first, I could hear birds and the occasional rustling of squirrels or rabbits in the underbrush, but about halfway in, the woods grew quieter. It wasn't creepy at that point, just different. Still, I kept going. I didn't see anyone else.
No hikers.
No campers, just trees, dirt, and the sound of my boots crunching along the trail. By around 3 p.m., I reached the clearing. It was more overgrown than I expected, but there was a flat area good for pitching a tent, and the lake shimmered in the sunlight just 100 yards away through the trees. I set up camp, cleared away sticks and small rocks, and got the tent up quickly. Then I sat down by the water, peeled off my boots, and let my feet soak. Felt peaceful, almost perfect. The water was cold and clear. I stayed there for about an hour before heading back to the campsite and starting a small fire with dry twigs and the matches I brought. I didn't need it for warmth, just for cooking and a bit of comfort. I boiled water, made some instant noodles, and ate slowly as the sun began to dip below the trees. When the light faded, the temperature dropped fast. The fire helped, but once it got dark, I found myself glancing into the woods more than I meant to. I didn't hear anything unusual. No howls or footsteps, just the regular forest noises, crickets, frogs, maybe the occasional owl. But something about being alone out there made every little sound feel sharper. The silence between those sounds felt longer. I tried not to let it get to me. I cleaned up, put the leftover food in a sealed bag and hung it from a tree, then climbed into the tent around 9 p.m. I read for a while by flashlight, then shut it off and tried to sleep. First, it was hard. Every rustle outside the tent made me hold my breath. I kept telling myself it was just animals, raccoons, maybe a deer, but even small noises can sound big when you're lying still in a dark tent. Around midnight, I must have finally dozed off. I woke up again at some point. I didn't check the time, but it was still pitch black. I'd heard something outside the tent. It was soft, but distinct. Not an animal snuffling around. It sounded more like a footstep on dry leaves. Just one. Then silence. I held my breath again, waiting, but didn't hear anything else. I lay there for at least 20 minutes, heart thumping, before eventually falling back asleep. The next morning was cloudy. I got up, stretched, and walked down to the lake again. Ate some oatmeal and dried fruit, then set off on a short hike along the water's edge. I followed the shoreline for about a mile, snapping a few pictures, just enjoying the quiet. But when I turned back and approached my campsite again, something felt different. My tent flap was open. I was sure I'd zipped it shut. I stopped about 20 feet away and stared at it. Nothing else looked disturbed. The food bag was still hanging from the tree. The fire pit was untouched. Slowly, I walked over and looked inside the tent. Everything was there. My sleeping bag, my pack, my flashlight, but they weren't in the same places I'd left them. The bag was unzipped and lying on its side. The flashlight was halfway under the sleeping bag. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself I'd just been careless. Maybe I didn't close the flap. Maybe I moved the bag and forgot. I didn't feel convinced. Still, nothing was missing and nothing was damaged. I took a deep breath and told myself I was overthinking it. I decided not to stay a third night, but I didn't want to leave right away either. I packed up most of my gear, just left the tent standing, and went for one last short hike, this time in the opposite direction. I figured I'd stretch my legs for an hour or two, then head back to the car and drive home before dark. I didn't get far. Maybe 15 minutes in, I noticed something strange. A small pile of sticks arranged in a shape. Not a perfect circle, but close. Nothing ritualistic or weird, just intentional, like someone had stopped and arranged them on purpose. I stepped around it, kept walking, but started seeing more of them. Small piles of twigs and pine cones, all in slightly different shapes. I told myself kids probably made them, or bored hikers, but I hadn't seen a single person in the area. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. A boot print, not mine, bigger, deeper. It was maybe 10 feet off the trail in a patch of soft dirt. I walked over and looked at it. The heel was worn, like it had been stepped in hard. And nearby I saw another, and another. Someone had been walking around off-trail in a wide circle, it seemed. I crouched down and stared at the prints, trying to guess how fresh they were. They didn't look old. The edges were still sharp. I stood up quickly, suddenly aware of how quiet the woods had gotten again. That's when I noticed something else. A tree stump about 20 feet away had something on top of it. I walked over and saw a small camping knife. Not mine, just sitting there on the flat stump, like someone had placed it intentionally. The handle was worn. The blade was dull and scratched. It didn't look like it had been there long. There wasn't any rust or dirt on it. I didn't touch it. I backed away, feeling like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anything around me but trees and shadows. I turned and started walking back toward camp faster than I meant to. The path felt longer on the way back. I kept glancing behind me, hearing things. Maybe just birds or branches snapping in the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I reached my campsite again, I froze. The tent had been knocked over. Not ripped or slashed, just flattened like someone had pulled the stakes and let it fall. I'd packed everything else, but the tent was still up when I left. I was sure of it. My heart started pounding. I looked around quickly, checked the trees, the underbrush, the trail. Nothing. No movement. No noise. I grabbed the tent, stuffed it into its bag without folding it, and slung everything onto my back. Then I started walking fast, almost jogging, down the trail back to my car. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I kept thinking about those footprints, the piles of sticks, the knife, the tent being knocked over. I hadn't seen anyone, but someone had clearly been out there. Someone knew I was camping alone. It took me nearly an hour to reach the parking area. When I broke through the last stretch of trees and saw my car, I nearly ran. But something made me stop again. The other car, the old sedan that was there when I arrived, was gone. I hadn't heard it leave. No engine noise, no gravel crunching, just gone. That meant someone had been nearby that whole time, possibly watching me, and had left without making a sound. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, and even then, I didn't relax. My mind was racing. I didn't know if I'd narrowly avoided something or if I was just scaring myself, but everything added up wrong. The tent, the footprints, the knife, the things in the tent being moved, none of that was okay. I told a friend about it later, left out the parts that made me sound paranoid, but I never reported it. I figured there was nothing to report. Nobody hurt me. Nothing was stolen. I had been waiting for time off work for a while, and when I finally got it, I decided I needed to get away from everything. I'd been living in Lincoln, Nebraska, for the last 5 years and hadn't really taken a break longer than a weekend in that time. Most people I knew were tied up with families or jobs, and I didn't feel like dragging someone else along just to make small talk the whole time. I just wanted some quiet, some space, and some distance from my phone, computer, and coworkers. So I planned a solo camping trip up to the Nebraska National Forest, a little out of the way from the usual tourist spots. The idea was simple: drive out there, hike in about 5 or 6 miles from the trailhead, set up a small base camp, spend a few days hiking, reading, sleeping, and eating basic meals. I left early on a Thursday morning in late September. It was that time of year where the days were still warm, but the nights had started to get cold, which I liked. No bugs, fewer people, no intense heat. I had a reliable old Toyota Tacoma that I packed with everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food, water, camp stove, flashlight, backup batteries, basic first aid kit, map and compass, extra clothes, a book, and my old camp chair. I'd done a few solo trips before, but never in that part of Nebraska and never that far off the trail. I got to the trailhead just after noon and spent maybe 10 minutes checking my gear before setting off. I didn't see another car in the small gravel lot, which felt perfect to me. The trail itself was narrow and mostly pine needle-covered dirt, weaving through tall trees and brush. It was peaceful and quiet, with nothing but the sound of wind and the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush, probably deer or squirrels. After hiking for about 3 hours, I started looking for a decent spot to set up camp. Eventually, I found a small clearing just off the trail, a couple 100 feet into the trees. It was flat, not too rocky, and surrounded by dense pines that gave it a kind of natural wall. There was a small rise behind it, like a low hill, and I figured that would help break the wind if it got strong overnight. I set up my tent, unfolded my chair, and started boiling some water for dinner. That night, I ate a simple freeze-dried meal, read by flashlight, and got into my sleeping bag around 9 p.m. The woods were dead silent. It took me a while to fall asleep, but eventually I did. I woke up in the dark sometime later to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, more like a rustling in the leaves nearby. I laid still, my heart beating fast, trying to figure out if it was an animal or just wind through the brush. The sound moved slowly, like footsteps, not heavy, but not tiny either. I waited, holding my breath, but after a minute or so it stopped. I stayed awake for a while, listening, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning was chilly and damp. My tent fly was wet with dew. I boiled some water for instant coffee, ate a granola bar, and packed a small day pack to go hiking further into the forest. I didn't plan to go far, just to a small overlook I'd seen on the map a couple miles west. The trail wasn't well marked out there, but I had a compass and a printed topo map. The walk was nice, still no people, just the sound of birds and the occasional crack of branches under my boots. I reached the overlook around midday and sat there for a while, looking out over the trees. It was quiet, so quiet it felt like I could hear my own blood moving. On the way back to camp, I took a slightly different route through the trees, which wasn't smart. It wasn't reckless. I could still orient myself and check my compass, but it wasn't the same trail I'd taken out. I ended up coming back into camp from a different angle, which made me stop for a second because I almost didn't recognize it. The tent was there, my chair, my stove, but something about it felt wrong. It looked too neat, like everything had been picked up and placed back down. I brushed it off as me being overly suspicious, but I took a mental note. That night was colder, and I fell asleep quickly. I was tired from hiking, but again, I woke up sometime past midnight. This time, I heard the same movement in the woods. It was closer, maybe 30 feet away. Just that same slow crunching of leaves, like someone walking carefully. I stayed completely still. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe deeply. I could tell whatever it was had weight. It wasn't a squirrel or a rabbit. It moved past my tent, then stopped. I didn't hear anything for a long time, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then it slowly moved away. When morning came, I got up and immediately checked the area around my tent. No obvious prints. No torn food bags, nothing disturbed. It made no sense. I started thinking maybe it was a deer walking nearby at night and my brain was just making it feel like something else. I told myself not to overreact. Still, I didn't hike that day. I stayed close to camp, sharpening sticks, cleaning gear, sorting through my pack, reading the same page of my book over and over. My nerves were shot. I kept glancing toward the trees. In the late afternoon, I went down a small slope behind my camp where there was a dry creek bed. That was when I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A footprint. A human footprint. Not a boot print like mine, but a barefoot one. Wide, flat, and smudged into the soft dirt near the edge of the creek bed. It wasn't big, but it was clear enough to tell it wasn't an animal. My stomach dropped. I knelt and looked closer. It was fresh. The edges were still clean, not dried out or blown over with leaves. Someone had been walking barefoot through the woods, probably that night or early that morning. I didn't know what to do. Packing up and hiking out would take hours, and I had maybe 2 hours of light left. I thought about it hard, then decided to stay one more night and leave at first light. I didn't want to get lost or twist an ankle trying to rush out in the dark. I cooked dinner with one hand on my pocket knife. I didn't eat much. I kept turning around, checking behind me every few minutes. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent, flashlight in my hand, knife within reach, just waiting, listening. I didn't hear anything. No steps, no leaves, nothing. At first light, I packed up camp in under 10 minutes. Tent still damp, half my food left behind. I stuffed everything into my pack and started walking, double-checking the compass every 5 minutes. I was paranoid. Every sound felt like footsteps. Every broken branch sounded like someone following. I didn't stop once. I walked hard and fast. My legs were sore, but I didn't slow down. After 4 hours, I reached the trailhead. My truck was there, just like I left it. I opened the door, threw my pack in the back, and sat there with the door open, just breathing. As I started the engine and backed out, I glanced in the side mirror. For a second, I saw something, or someone, far off at the edge of the tree line, barely visible, a shape, standing still, watching. I didn't stop to check. I didn't look again. I just drove, fast, back to the highway, back to Lincoln, back to noise and light and people. I didn't sleep much for the next few days. Every sound in my apartment felt like footsteps outside my window. I kept thinking about that footprint, about that noise in the dark, about the shape I saw in the mirror. A week later, I reported it anonymously to the local forest ranger station. I didn't give my name. I just told them I'd seen evidence of someone moving through that part of the forest without proper gear, possibly barefoot. I don't know if they checked it out. I never followed up. I haven't been back since. It's not that I think someone was going to hurt me. Maybe they were just living out there off the grid, not wanting to be seen. But it was how quiet they were, how close they came, how they never made themselves known. That's what stayed with me, that someone could be that close, that careful, that silent. Close enough to watch, to walk past my tent, to stand at the edge of camp without me ever knowing what they wanted. That's what I think about most, and that's why I won't ever camp alone again. After that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about that campsite was wrong. Not supernatural. There was nothing ghostly or magical about it, but real, dangerous in a way you don't expect from the woods. I told myself it was probably just some drifter or a hunter passing through, but the way they moved, slow and quiet, and the warmth of the ashes in that abandoned fire pit told me it wasn't just a random passerby. Someone had been there recently, watching, waiting, maybe even following me. I decided not to go back there for a long time, but the woods had gotten under my skin. I kept thinking about what I might have missed, what that person might have wanted. I went back to my regular life, but every time I went outside, every time I passed by a park or a trail, I felt uneasy, like eyes were on me, waiting for a moment when I'd let my guard down. Weeks later, I found myself with a little more free time, and curiosity started to gnaw at me. I wanted to understand what had happened, to face whatever it was that made me so unsettled. I reached out to some local rangers and asked about the area where I'd camped. One of them mentioned that the forest was sometimes used by people who didn't want to be found. Drifters, people escaping trouble, sometimes even criminals hiding out. They warned me not to go back alone. That warning didn't stop me. This time, I went with a friend, someone familiar with the area, someone who knew how to spot signs of other people in the wild. We packed lightly but carefully, bringing more supplies and a GPS device, plus a small handheld radio for emergencies. When we arrived at the site, the air was crisp and fresh. The trees looked the same, the leaves crunching underfoot like they had before. But this time, I noticed small signs that I hadn't seen in my panic the first time. Footprints partially covered by leaves, broken twigs where someone had pushed through bushes, faint markings carved into tree bark. It was like a trail, but not one made by animals or hikers. It was deliberate. We followed the trail deeper into the forest, moving slowly and quietly. The feeling of being watched returned, but with my friend there, it felt less like panic and more like cautious awareness. The trail led us to a small clearing, where we found an old, worn tarp tied between two trees, with some empty cans and plastic bottles around it. It was clearly a makeshift shelter, someone's temporary hideout. We stayed silent, scanning the woods carefully. There were no signs of the person, no movement, no fresh footprints nearby, but the shelter was too fresh to have been abandoned for long. We took some pictures and made notes, planning to report it later. That night, we camped a little further away from the original spot, using a small clearing by a stream. As I lay on my sleeping bag, staring up at the sky again, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. The forest was still dark, still full of unknown sounds, but I wasn't alone this time. The next morning, we packed up and left the woods. I felt different, like I had faced a shadow I didn't fully understand but wasn't powerless against. The woods, I realized, weren't just a place to escape to. They held stories. Stories of people, sometimes lost, sometimes dangerous, sometimes just trying to survive away from the world. Back home, I reported the shelter site to the forest rangers. They told me they would keep an eye on it, maybe send patrols to make sure no one dangerous was staying there too long. I didn't ask for details, and they didn't offer them. Some things, I guess, are better left to those who watch the woods every day. Since then, I've gone camping a few more times, but always with company. I never camped alone again in that part of the forest. I learned to respect not just the quiet beauty of the woods, but also the very real, very human dangers hidden beneath the trees and shadows. The experience taught me something important. Sometimes, The scariest thing in the wilderness isn't what you imagine. It's the unpredictable reality of other people, their stories, their secrets. And sometimes, the best way to face that fear is not to run, but to understand it, be aware, and never ignore the signs around you. I never saw or heard from that person again. Maybe they moved on, maybe they left the forest, or maybe they stayed hidden in those woods. But I carry that night with me, a reminder that the world is bigger, stranger, and more complicated than I thought. And that sometimes, the safest thing you can do is respect the darkness, trust your instincts, and never go alone. I had been feeling burnt out for months. Work was nonstop, my phone never stopped buzzing, and even on weekends I couldn't relax. I needed a break, not just a weekend off. I needed to be completely alone, away from the city, somewhere I could breathe. I remembered this old cabin my uncle had owned deep in the woods of northern Oregon. He passed away years ago, and the place hadn't been used much since. It wasn't listed on any rental site, just a quiet, rundown structure tucked behind a patch of private forest that no one really visited. I managed to get the keys from my cousin, who warned me it hadn't been checked in a long time. I didn't care. I wanted solitude, no cell signal, no people, no noise, just trees, fresh air, and time to clear my head. I drove up on a Tuesday morning in late September. The highway gave way to cracked, narrow roads, then finally to dirt paths riddled with rocks and overgrown grass. My tires kicked up a thick cloud of dust as I made my way down the final stretch. The cabin appeared slowly behind a bend, wooden, weathered, and smaller than I remembered. The roof looked intact, though faded and streaked with moss. One of the window shutters hung crooked. Still, it stood. I parked a few feet away, killed the engine, and listened. No cars, no people, just wind moving through the trees. I hauled my bag inside and looked around. The air smelled like dry wood, old dust, and a faint scent of pine. There was a single room with a bed, a small kitchen area with a rusty sink, and an old wood stove. I opened the windows to air it out, then checked the back door, which led to a small deck overlooking a slope of trees. The view was perfect, nothing but forest stretching far into the hills. I hadn't brought much, just food, water, a first aid kit, matches, and a flashlight. No laptop, no phone. I left my phone in the glove compartment on purpose. The first day passed in silence. I walked around, gathering small branches and stacking them neatly under the porch. I checked the inside of the cabin for mice or anything that needed to be cleaned. Just some old leaves and dust. I found an axe in the shed and split a few logs until my arms felt sore. I ate some bread and fruit, then sat on the deck and watched the sky turn orange, then deep blue. The quiet was almost unsettling at first, like my brain couldn't process the lack of noise. But I liked it. That night, I laid in the bed and listened. Creaked a little, but it held. I heard branches brushing against the roof, some animal rustling through the brush outside. Normal sounds. I stared at the ceiling for hours, not really tired, just adjusting. There was no electricity, so I used a battery lantern until I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun barely pierced the mist outside. I made some coffee over a tiny gas burner I'd brought and sat on the deck with a blanket over my shoulders. The air felt colder than I expected. I made a mental note to gather more firewood. After eating, I decided to hike down the slope behind the cabin. The trail wasn't official, just a worn footpath my uncle must have used years ago. It led down through heavy trees and soft moss-covered ground. I kept going for about an hour, just enjoying the sounds of birds and leaves. Eventually, I stopped at a small stream. I sat down and splashed some water on my face. It felt good to be disconnected. I was about to head back when I noticed something half-buried near a fallen log. It looked like an old tarp or canvas, partially hidden under dirt and leaves. I dug around it with a stick. Underneath was a rusted metal box. Nothing fancy, just a beat-up toolbox with one hinge broken. I pried it open. Inside were random things: an old hunting knife, a soaked notebook with pages stuck together, a broken pair of sunglasses, and a few bullet casings. It looked like someone had stashed it there years ago and forgotten about it. I flipped through the notebook. Most of the writing was ruined by water, but I could make out a few words here and there. Dates, numbers, some short notes. It didn't seem important, but something about the way it was hidden felt strange. Not like someone accidentally left it there, like they didn't want it found. I decided to take it back with me. Back at the cabin, I left the box on the table and started a small fire outside to cook dinner. That night, while lying in bed, I kept thinking about the notebook. Why stash it? Why hide it under a tarp in the middle of nowhere? The entries didn't say much, but one page near the middle was clearer than the others. It said, "Stay away from the ridge," marked the trees. Then a date, August 18th, 2003. That stuck in my head. The ridge. I remembered the hill north of the cabin, steeper than the others with taller trees. I hadn't gone that way yet. I made a plan to hike there the next morning. I set out early. The path to the ridge was thick with underbrush, and I had to use the knife from the box to cut through some brambles. The air felt different, heavier. The trees got denser the closer I got to the base. Then I saw the first marked tree, a large pine with a deep X carved into the bark. The cut looked old, weathered, not fresh. I looked around and saw another tree maybe 20 feet away with the same mark. Then another. The marks formed a line curving up the slope. I followed them, climbing carefully. The soil was loose in some areas, and I had to catch myself a few times. Eventually, I reached a flat area near the top where the trees thinned out. In the middle was a large stone, almost like a table. It didn't look natural. Someone had placed it there. Moss covered most of it, but I could see old stains on the surface, dark, brown, dried out. Animal blood, maybe. I looked around and found more bullet casings nearby, along with a coil of rusted wire. I stood there for a while, not sure what I was looking at. Some kind of hunting spot? A place where someone skinned deer? But why mark the trees? And why leave that warning in the notebook? I didn't stay long. Something about the area made my skin crawl. I backed away and made my way down the hill fast, taking a different path to avoid the marked trees. Back at the cabin, I locked the door, even though I was in the middle of nowhere. I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside, twigs snapping, a low rustle just beyond the window. I told myself it was just my mind messing with me, just animals, but the unease stayed. The next day, I didn't explore. I stayed near the cabin, chopped wood, cleaned the stove, anything to keep busy. I didn't look at the box or the notebook again. But that night, as I sat in the dark with only the lantern glowing, I heard something that wasn't an animal. A sharp thud, like a rock hitting wood. Then another. Not fast, not random, slow, spaced out, deliberate. I turned off the lantern and sat still, heart pounding. I stared at the window, but it was too dark to see anything. The sounds stopped after a few minutes. I stayed awake until dawn. That morning, I found 3 small rocks placed neatly on the front steps. Clean, smooth, different from the dirt and gravel around the cabin. Someone had put them there. I packed my stuff in less than an hour. I left most of the food and supplies. I didn't care. I got in the car and drove back the same way I came, glancing in the mirror every few minutes. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't report anything because nothing really happened. Just noises, markings, old tools, and a creepy notebook. But I knew someone had been out there. Someone who wanted that area to stay hidden. Maybe a hunter. Maybe someone who did things they didn't want seen. Maybe it was nothing, but I trusted my gut. Something about that ridge wasn't right. I never went back. A few months later, I saw a small news story buried in the back pages of a local paper. A hiker had gone missing in that forest. They found his backpack near the ridge, but not him. No foul play confirmed. Just another disappearance. I never forgot the notebook. I never forgot the marks on those trees. I still think about that stone at the top of the hill and the way the forest felt different up there. I wanted quiet, I wanted peace. I found it, but it came with something else. I learned that some places are quiet for a reason. Some parts of the woods aren't meant to be found. I rented a small off-grid cabin in northern Minnesota for a week last fall. I was burned out from work and just needed space. Real space. The kind of space where you can't hear anything except wind and leaves and the occasional rustle of an animal. I found the cabin through a lesser-known rental site. It wasn't fancy, just one room, a small kitchenette, a wood stove, and an outhouse maybe 20 yards away. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal. That was the point. I wanted out, and this place was out. The owner left the key under a flat rock near the front steps, just like he said he would. The place was surrounded by thick woods. It sat on a slight hill that sloped down into a patch of swampy land and then a stretch of pine forest beyond. The nearest paved road was about 6 miles out, and you had to take a narrow dirt trail to get there. I barely made it in my Subaru. It bottomed out twice, but the cabin itself was intact, even if it was weather-worn and kind of leaning to one side. The roof didn't leak, and the door shut tight. That's all I needed. The first night was peaceful. I cooked canned chili on the small gas stove and listened to the wind pushing through the trees. There were so many stars outside, more than I'd seen in years. I sat on the front steps for almost an hour just staring at them, wrapped in a thick hoodie and listening to distant owls calling each other. When I finally went to bed, the silence was so complete that it took me a long time to fall asleep. I kept hearing little things, branches tapping, tiny rustlings, but that's nature. I eventually drifted off. The second day, I spent exploring the woods behind the cabin. I followed a narrow game trail for about an hour, taking photos and keeping track of my direction. I found an old deer stand nailed up into a tree about 12 feet off the ground. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The ladder rungs were rotting. A rusted thermos sat up on the platform. I left it alone and kept walking. Around midday, I turned back. I didn't want to push too far and get lost. The trail was starting to fade, and even though I had a compass and a GPS watch, it still made me uneasy. Back at the cabin, I made some coffee and sat near the wood stove as the sun dipped lower. Around 6 or so, I heard what sounded like something heavy walking through the brush out behind the cabin. I froze for a second and then got up and looked out the back window. Nothing. Probably a deer. Could have even been a bear, but they usually stayed clear of people. I didn't go out to check. That night, I had trouble sleeping again. I kept waking up, and each time I felt more on edge. There was a low creaking noise from the back wall of the cabin. It wasn't wind. It sounded more like something lightly pressing or brushing against the wall. I held my breath, staring into the darkness, listening. The sound would stop for a while, then come back, then stop again. I finally got up, pulled on my boots, and stepped outside with my flashlight. I walked all the way around the cabin. Nothing. No prints, no sign of anything. I figured maybe it was an animal trying to scratch or chew at the wood. I knocked on the wall to scare anything off and went back inside. Locked the door. I told myself I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. The next morning, I found a faint boot print in the mud about 20 feet from the back of the cabin. It wasn't mine. Mine had a distinct tread pattern. This one was flatter, more worn out like an old work boot. I crouched and looked at it for a long time. It was pointing toward the cabin, not away. I looked around and didn't see any more. The ground was mostly covered in dry pine needles, so there wouldn't be clear prints unless it rained. I told myself maybe it was old, maybe from the owner or another renter. Still, it bothered me. That afternoon, I walked back to the deer stand. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to. I climbed up it this time, testing each step carefully. The wood was cracked but held. From up there, I could see the tops of the trees stretching for miles. It was quiet, too quiet. After a few minutes, I climbed down and started heading back. I kept looking behind me. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that something was different. Back at the cabin, I checked all the windows. Locked. Door locked. I even dragged the small table in front of the door just for peace of mind. I didn't light the lantern that night, just used a flashlight and kept it pointed low. I stayed awake for hours, sitting on the bed with my back against the wall. I kept hearing that soft brushing sound again from the back of the cabin. At one point, it was rhythmic like slow dragging. I didn't go outside this time, I just sat there holding the hatchet I'd brought for chopping wood. My heart was pounding the entire time. At some point, I dozed off from sheer exhaustion. When I woke up, it was just starting to get light outside. I got dressed, stepped outside, and immediately noticed something was off. The outhouse door was wide open. I always shut it. I walked over, looked inside. Nothing, but the smell was stronger than usual, like something had been in there disturbing it. Around the edges of the door frame were fresh scratches, thin and horizontal like from fingernails or maybe a knife. I looked closer, there were at least 8 or 9 of them. Not animal scratches. These were deliberate. I packed my bag right then. I had planned to stay a week, but it was day 4, and I'd had enough. I didn't even eat breakfast. I stuffed everything into my pack, threw it in the car, and started driving. The dirt trail out felt even narrower than before. The trees seemed to crowd in tighter. At one point, I thought I saw someone standing far off in the woods, just between 2 trees, but when I looked again, they were gone. Could have been a trick of the light. I made it to the paved road around noon. I drove straight to a gas station with a strong cell signal and called the cabin owner. He didn't pick up. I left a message saying I'd left early and that something felt off about the place. I didn't go into detail. I didn't think he'd believe me. I went back home and tried to forget about it. But a week later, I got a text from an unknown number. It said only one thing: "You made the right choice." I stared at it for a long time. I never replied. I blocked the number and deleted the message. I didn't recognize the area code, and I've never given out that number to anyone except family and work. A few days after that, I searched for the cabin listing online. It was gone. The whole rental site account had been removed. I even tried looking up the coordinates from an old screenshot. The satellite view showed the cabin still there, but the woods around it were different, somehow more overgrown than I remembered. Like no one had touched it in years. I don't know who was out there with me. I don't know how long they'd been watching or why they didn't do anything worse. Maybe they were just trying to scare me off. If that was the case, it worked. I never went back, and I never will. All I know is that someone had been there. The boot print wasn't mine. The scratches weren't from animals. And that message wasn't random. Someone was out there, and I think they were used to being alone in that place. Maybe I had intruded on their space. Maybe I got lucky. Either way, I left just in time. That week changed the way I think about being alone. I still go on solo trips, but never without cell service, and never anywhere I can't leave in under 10 minutes. I carry a firearm now, and I tell people exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. Because out there in the woods, you're not always alone, even when you think you are. I rented the cabin because I needed a break. That was it. I wasn't trying to run from anything or anyone. Life had just been too loud, too fast, and too heavy for a while. Work had gotten ridiculous with the long hours and endless video calls. My apartment in the city felt more like a storage closet than a home. So I took 2 weeks off in early October, found a cabin online that looked private enough, and booked it. It was just outside a little place called Millerton in northern Vermont. From the pictures, it looked clean and simple. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a decent-sized kitchen, and a small porch looking out over some trees. I didn't want anything fancy. I just wanted quiet. I drove up early on a Monday morning. Took about 6 hours from where I lived in Hartford. The roads got narrower the farther I drove, and the last stretch was a dirt road that twisted through a thick patch of woods. There were no houses nearby that I could see. That was a good sign to me. No cars driving by. No one blasting music. Just trees, birds, and me. When I pulled up to the cabin, it was exactly what I expected. The place sat on a little clearing, surrounded on all sides by woods. There was a gravel patch to park on, and a short set of steps led up to the porch. The air smelled like pine and cold leaves. The wind was light but steady, moving through the trees like soft whispering. I didn't feel uneasy, just tired and ready to shut off. I unpacked the car, brought in my bags and groceries, then took a slow walk around the cabin. There wasn't much to it. The porch was sturdy, with an old bench and a small stack of firewood. Around back, there was a little shed with a padlock on it. I didn't have the key and didn't care to look inside. The back of the cabin faced more woods, thicker here, with ferns and fallen limbs all tangled together. There was no fence or trail, just trees and more trees. Inside, the place was clean and smelled faintly like cedar. There was a small living room with a couch and an old recliner. A short hallway led to a bedroom, a bathroom, and a little office with a desk and a chair. The kitchen had everything I needed: a fridge, stove, sink, and a cabinet stocked with mismatched plates and mugs. There was even a working coffee pot. The fridge was empty except for a box of baking soda and a few expired condiment packets, which I tossed. I settled in fast. By sunset, I had a fire going in the fireplace and a frozen pizza in the oven. I didn't bother turning on the TV. I just sat in the recliner, ate dinner off a paper plate, and listened to the fire crackle. Outside, the woods had gone quiet. That's something that takes getting used to. During the day, you hear birds and insects, but at night, it goes dead silent, like the trees are holding their breath. The first 2 days were peaceful. I read a few books I brought, took short hikes around the area, and made simple meals. I didn't see anyone. Not a hiker, not a ranger, not even a parked car. The only signs of other people were a few distant contrails overhead and one faint engine rumble way off through the trees. I started sleeping better, too. I hadn't realized how tense my body had been until I finally let go of it. But on the third night, I heard something that didn't fit. It was about 1 a.m, and I'd just woken up to use the bathroom. I wasn't groggy or dreaming. I was fully awake. As I finished washing my hands, I heard it. A thud, not loud but clear, came from outside. I froze and listened. Another thud, then a pause, then something that sounded like scraping, metal on wood or something heavy being dragged across a surface. I walked quietly to the front window and looked out, trying to let my eyes adjust to the moonlight. The trees were still. The clearing was empty. Then one more sound, short, sharp, like a knock. I stood there for a long time just listening, but nothing else happened. After a while, I convinced myself it was probably a branch that had fallen, or maybe a raccoon had knocked something over. Still, I locked the doors and windows, then went back to bed. My heart didn't slow down for an hour. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were no branches on the porch or the roof. Nothing had fallen. The firewood stack was undisturbed. I circled to the back and noticed something that made me stop. The shed's padlock was gone. It wasn't broken. It wasn't hanging open. It was just gone. The door to the shed was still closed, but now it was only held shut by a rusty hook latch at the top. That latch didn't look like it could stop a strong wind, let alone a person. I didn't open it. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to find out what was inside, or maybe I already knew I wouldn't like it. I spent the rest of the day indoors. I made myself stay calm, made lunch, read for a while, and tried to nap, but I kept thinking about the lock. I hadn't touched it, and I hadn't seen anyone around. Could someone have come at night? Maybe a local? Someone checking on the place? That didn't make sense, though. Why not knock? Why not say something? When it got dark, I closed every curtain and turned off most of the lights. I sat in the recliner with a blanket over me and a kitchen knife tucked under a magazine on the side table. I felt stupid, but I wasn't going to sleep through the night again without something to grab. Nothing happened that night. Not one noise, not one movement, but I barely slept. The next morning, I went straight out to the shed. The hook was still latched. I opened it slowly and pulled the door open. Creaked. Inside, it was dusty and dim, with a sliver of light coming through a cracked board in the wall. There wasn't much in there. A rusted snow shovel, a few cracked plastic bins, and a half-empty bag of potting soil. That was it. Nothing that explained the missing lock. No animals. No signs of anyone living in there. I left it open and walked back inside, still feeling like I'd missed something. I started to keep track of things after that. I took pictures of the shed door each morning, wrote down what I did during the day, and checked the doors and windows every few hours. I felt crazy doing it, but I needed to know if anything changed. 3 days passed with nothing strange. The woods stayed quiet. The shed door never moved. I started to relax again. I even started planning a short hike down an old trail I'd found the first day. That night, I went to bed early, just after sunset. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They weren't loud, but they were unmistakable. Slow, steady, crunching on the gravel outside. They stopped for a moment, then moved again, closer this time. I held my breath and sat up in bed, listening hard. The footsteps circled to the back of the cabin. Then I heard another sound, something lighter, a creak. It was the shed door. I climbed out of bed and moved to the bedroom window. I couldn't see much, but I stayed there for a long time, watching. No one came into view. I didn't hear the door close. I waited until the sky started to get lighter before I stepped outside. The shed door was wide open. Inside, nothing looked disturbed, but I noticed something different this time. There were fresh footprints in the dirt just inside the door. Not boot prints, sneakers, maybe. The tread was faint, but they were definitely new. I backed out, locked the front door behind me, and sat down on the floor with my back to it. I thought about leaving. I should have left, but I kept telling myself I'd be gone in 4 days anyway. I didn't want to call the cops and say, "What? Someone opened a shed?" There was no damage, no theft. Nothing had happened to me, but that night something did. Just after midnight, I was reading on the couch when I heard the back door handle rattle. It wasn't wind. It wasn't subtle. Someone tried it once, paused, then again, harder. I grabbed the kitchen knife and stood frozen, staring at the door. I heard footsteps retreat. A minute later, the front door handle moved. Then nothing. I stayed up all night, knife in hand, lights off, peeking through curtains. I never saw anyone. At dawn, I walked the perimeter again. No footprints, no damage. The shed was shut this time. That morning, I packed everything. I wasn't waiting anymore. I loaded my car and locked the cabin behind me. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror again and again. Nothing followed me. Nothing moved in the trees. I drove straight to a motel in town and slept there, door bolted, chair under the knob. The next morning, I called the rental agency and told them I left early. Didn't give a reason. I never heard back. A week later, back home, I couldn't stop thinking about that cabin. I pulled up the listing online, but it was gone. Deleted. The host's account wasn't even active anymore. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know they were real. They walked around that cabin, they watched it, and they tried the doors. I think they were waiting for something. Maybe just a mistake. Maybe for me to leave one door unlocked, one window cracked open. I'm careful now. I double lock everything. I don't stay in remote places anymore. I don't go where I can't see neighbors or hear cars. I've never felt safe the same way. The moment I drove away from the city and onto the narrow, twisting road that led into the forest, I could feel the noise and rush of everyday life fading behind me. The trees grew thick on both sides of the road, their branches arching overhead like a green tunnel. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled light onto the asphalt. I was heading to a cabin I had rented for the weekend, a place I'd never been before but had found online during a long, stressful week at work. I didn't want crowds, I didn't want noise. I just wanted to get away and be alone with nature. The GPS gave me clear directions, but the last few miles were over a rough dirt path that jutted deep into the woods. My small car bumped and rattled on the uneven surface. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, eyes fixed on the narrow road ahead, surrounded by thick pines and oaks that seemed to press closer with every turn. The smell of pine needles mixed with damp earth filled the air through the cracked windows. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched long and the forest darkened. When I finally saw the cabin, it was a small wooden structure sitting in a clearing. It looked old but well kept, with a sloped roof and a small porch. A stack of firewood was neatly piled by the side. The windows were dark, reflecting the deepening sky. I parked and stepped out, the silence around me so complete it felt strange. No cars, no distant voices, just the soft rustling of leaves and occasional bird calls. I had no cell signal here, and honestly, I welcomed the disconnection. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of moss and wood smoke. I took my backpack and walked up the steps onto the porch, feeling the rough wood under my boots. I opened the door, and inside the cabin smelled like dry wood and old blankets. It was small but cozy, with a simple kitchen area, a table, a bed in the corner, and a wood stove. A few cans of food and bottles of water sat on the shelves. The place had basic electricity powered by a generator, but I wasn't expecting to use much. I wanted this to be a break from screens and constant connectivity. I unpacked my things slowly, setting my clothes in the small closet and putting my food in the old-fashioned fridge. Outside, the sky was turning deep blue, the first stars beginning to show. I built a fire in the stove, feeling the warmth spread through the room as the flames crackled and popped. The cabin was quiet except for the sounds of the fire and the occasional creak of the wood settling. I found an old book on the shelf and sat near the stove, reading by the flickering light. Night came fully fast. The wind whispered through the trees outside, carrying a chill that made me pull my sweater tighter around me. I shut the windows and double-checked the locks on the door. Even though the cabin felt safe, a part of me was aware I was truly alone. I thought about the drive-in, how remote the place was, and how far I was from anyone who could help if something went wrong. I didn't sleep well that first night. Every little sound outside, branches snapping, the occasional rustle of an animal in the bushes, made me tense. The moon was full and cast silvery light through the window, making shadows on the walls. I kept imagining someone or something watching from just beyond the tree line, though I knew it was just my mind playing tricks. The isolation was heavy. Morning came slow and gray, the sky thick with clouds that muted the light. I brewed coffee on the small stove and stepped outside to stretch. The air was damp, and the ground covered with fallen leaves and pine needles. I looked around the clearing, the trees standing tall and silent. I planned to hike a bit today, so I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a flashlight. I didn't want to wander too far. I wasn't familiar with the forest, and the thick underbrush made it easy to get lost. As I walked, the forest around me felt alive in a way that was both beautiful and unsettling. Birds called overhead, insects buzzed, and small animals darted in the brush. But there was also a deep stillness that felt almost too quiet. The trees grew closer together in places, their trunks thick and rough. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and stones. I kept my eyes on the path I was following, occasionally glancing behind me to check my route. After about an hour, I reached a small creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones with a gentle murmur. I knelt down and cupped my hands to drink, feeling the chill bite into my skin. The forest around the creek was thicker, the canopy closing overhead and blocking much of the sky. The air smelled fresher here, mixed with wet earth and the faint scent of decaying leaves. I stood and took a deep breath, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had started to creep in. On the way back to the cabin, I thought about how isolated I really was. No cell phone, no other people around, no nearby roads. If something happened, if I got hurt or lost, there was no one to call for help. That thought lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow. I quickened my pace, eager to get back before dark. Back at the cabin, I prepared a simple meal and settled near the fire again. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows and making the branches scrape against the roof. I double-checked the door locks once more. The sounds of the forest at night were louder now. Owls hooting, the distant cry of some animal, the snap of twigs. I told myself I was just hearing normal forest noises, but a knot had formed in my stomach. That night, as I lay on the creaky bed, I heard footsteps outside. Soft, slow steps moving around the cabin. I froze, heart pounding. I stayed still and listened. The footsteps stopped, then something brushed against the porch railing. I held my breath, every muscle tense. After a long moment, the sounds faded into the wind. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. Still, sleep came fitfully. The next morning, I found a small pile of broken branches and disturbed leaves just outside the cabin door. like something had been trying to make a path or scratch at the wood. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I looked around but saw no footprints, no clear signs of any animal or person. It was as if whatever had been there was careful not to leave a trace. I spent the day trying to keep my mind busy. I cleaned the cabin a bit, gathered more firewood, and made notes in a journal I had brought along. But every time I looked out the window, I felt eyes watching from the trees. The forest was alive in a way I hadn't expected, unpredictable and dark beneath its quiet surface. As the sun began to set again, I decided to take extra precautions. I set up a few makeshift alarms, strings tied to cans that would clang if disturbed, and kept a heavy stick by the door. I knew I wasn't likely to fend off anything dangerous, but it made me feel a little safer. The wind had picked up again, whistling through the branches and sending leaves swirling in the air. That night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, circling the cabin several times. The cans clanged softly in the darkness. I lay awake, listening to the sounds of someone or something moving just beyond the window. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. I gripped the stick tightly, ready for whatever might come. At some point, the footsteps stopped. The night fell silent once more except for the crackling of the fire. Exhausted and shaken, I finally drifted off to sleep. The following morning, I was determined to leave. I packed quickly, my hands trembling as I stuffed my clothes and belongings into my bag. The forest no longer felt like a refuge but a trap. I locked the cabin door behind me and walked briskly toward my car, eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The drive out was tense. Every bump in the road, every shadow between the trees made me flinch. When I finally reached the paved road and saw the first signs of civilization, power lines, houses in the distance, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I was safe again. Looking back at the forest from a distance, I knew I had pushed myself far outside my comfort zone. The cabin had promised peace and solitude, but it had also shown me how fragile that peace could be when you're truly alone and cut off from the world. I realized then how important it was to be prepared and cautious, even when seeking escape. That weekend taught me a lot, not just about the forest or the cabin, but about fear and the strength it takes to face it. The memories of those footsteps, the silence, and the watching eyes stayed with me for a long time. But in the end, I left the forest behind and returned to the life I knew, grateful for the safety and the company of others. The cabin was just a place, but the experience was something I carried with me. It reminded me that being alone can be as terrifying as it is peaceful, and that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts, but the very real feeling of vulnerability and uncertainty in the dark. The sun was already low when I arrived at the cabin. It was a small, weathered structure tucked deep into the woods, far from any real town or road. The gravel driveway leading to it was overgrown with grass and small saplings, as if the place hadn't seen visitors in a long time. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. I was alone, just me and the cabin for the next few days, a planned break from the noise of the city and the endless screen glare of work. I pushed open the creaky front door, the hinges protesting with a long groan. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled musty, like wood that had soaked up years of rain and dust. The floorboards creaked underfoot, uneven and worn smooth by time. A thin layer of dust coated the furniture. A rickety wooden table, a couple of chairs, and an old sofa with fabric faded beyond recognition. The fireplace was cold, its blackened bricks stained from countless fires long dead. I had brought a small suitcase, a few groceries, and a backpack with supplies. I set down my bags and flipped on the battery-powered lantern I'd brought along. Its soft, yellow light flickered across the walls, revealing faded wallpaper peeling in places and the thick wooden beams supporting the low ceiling. The windows were grimy and small, letting in little daylight. Despite the dust and age, the cabin felt solid, as if it had stood its ground against many storms. My plan was simple. For 3 days, I'd disconnect. No phone, no internet, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and whatever silence I could find. I'd brought some books, a journal, and enough food to get by. I'd camped before, but this was different. A real cabin in the middle of nowhere. No neighbors for miles, no cars, no lights other than what I made myself. After unpacking, I made a quick meal of canned beans heated over a small camping stove on the old kitchen counter. The sink was rusty, the faucet barely dripping water that smelled faintly metallic. I filled my water bottle and set it on the table. Then I stepped outside, breathing in the crisp evening air. The forest stretched out in every direction, thick with towering pines and hardwoods, their branches whispering softly in the wind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turned a deep shade of orange, bleeding into purple. Birds chirped their last songs before settling in for the night. The first stars began to appear, faint pinpricks of light in the growing dark. I set a fire in the fireplace using some dry kindling I found stacked near the door. The flames sputtered and caught, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sitting close, I pulled out my journal and began to write. The only sound the crackling fire and the occasional rustle from outside. Night settled in fully. The forest was alive with sounds. Owls hooting somewhere far away, the scurrying of small animals in the underbrush, and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. It was peaceful but also made me aware of how isolated I truly was. Sleep was slow to come. The wooden floorboards creaked with every shift of the wind, and every small noise seemed amplified in the silence. I kept telling myself it was just animals, the natural world doing what it does. Eventually, I dozed off on the old sofa, a wool blanket wrapped tightly around me. The next morning, I woke to gray skies and a light drizzle tapping on the roof. The cabin smelled damp now, the moisture seeping through the thin walls. I boiled water over the stove for coffee and stood by the window, watching the drops bead and run down the glass. Outside, the forest was shrouded in mist, the trees appearing ghostly and distant. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, sticking close but trying to get a feel for the land. The forest floor was covered in leaves and broken branches, soft moss growing on fallen logs. Bird calls echoed between the trees. I found a narrow trail that led down to a small stream, its water clear and cold. I crouched and filled my water bottle, careful not to disturb the stones beneath the surface. Back at the cabin, I worked on cleaning a bit, wiping down surfaces and sweeping dust from the floor. I checked the woodpile outside and brought in some logs for the evening fire. The drizzle stopped, but the sky remained thick with clouds. As the light faded again, I built the fire, its warmth chasing away the chill. The cabin felt smaller at night, shadows creeping into every corner. The silence pressed in, making my own breathing sound loud and strange. That night, around midnight, I woke to a noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was different, more deliberate. A soft tapping, like someone or something knocking on the outside walls. I froze, heart pounding. The cabin's wooden frame creaked in response, but the tapping continued, slow and rhythmic. I wanted to convince myself it was just a branch hitting the cabin or an animal, but the sound felt too steady, too purposeful. I stayed still, eyes wide in the dark, listening. The tapping stopped after a minute, leaving the cabin silent once more except for the fire's crackle. I told myself it was nothing, but sleep didn't come easily after that. The next day, I was more alert, my senses on edge. I spent hours walking the perimeter of the cabin, looking for signs of what might have caused the tapping. There were no broken branches or footprints near the cabin. The forest floor was soft from the rain, but nothing disturbed close to the walls. I went deeper into the woods, hoping to lose myself in the trees and find some peace. The damp earth was soft beneath my boots, and the smell of pine was strong. I moved carefully, watching for any wildlife. Deer tracks appeared in the mud, but nothing else seemed out of place. Returning to the cabin, I found the door slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it tightly before. My heart jumped. I stepped inside quickly, scanning the room. Nothing was missing or moved, but the air felt colder, heavier somehow. I checked the windows, all locked as before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not in a ghostly way, but in a very real, very human way. Someone or something had been near the cabin. That night, I kept the fire burning late, sharpening a kitchen knife just in case. The tapping returned, this time louder, more insistent, came from the back of the cabin. I grabbed the lantern and crept to the door, swinging it open quickly to face the darkness. Nothing. I shone the light around the perimeter but saw no movement, no shapes. The forest was silent. I closed the door and bolted it, then sat down trying to calm my racing mind. The following morning, I found footprints in the soft earth near the cabin. Muddy, large, and definitely human. They led into the woods but did not return. Whoever had been here was cautious, but definitely watching. I considered leaving, but the nearest town was over an hour away, and the rain had returned, making the dirt road slick and treacherous. Plus, part of me wanted to prove I wasn't scared. This was just an old cabin in the woods, nothing more. I spent the next day repairing some loose boards on the porch and stacking more wood for the fire. Every now and then, I glanced into the trees, feeling eyes on me. That evening, the tapping was gone. The silence was thick but somehow less tense. I settled in early, reading by the fire. The wind howled outside, shaking the cabin gently, but inside I felt safe, almost. Just before dawn, a sudden, loud crash jolted me awake. I grabbed the lantern and hurried outside, heart hammering in my chest. Near the edge of the forest, I found a fallen tree, snapped at the base. Something big had pushed it over, too big for any deer or bear I'd seen before. Branches lay twisted and broken. I shone my light around but saw no movement. I knew then that whatever was out there was stronger, more dangerous than I had expected. I packed my bags quickly, deciding to leave at first light. I didn't care about the solitude anymore. Safety was the priority. As dawn broke, I locked up the cabin and started down the dirt road, eyes constantly scanning the trees. The forest seemed to watch me leave, silent and still. On the drive back, my mind replayed every noise, every shadow, every footstep. I didn't see anyone else on the road or near the cabin, but I knew I hadn't been alone. When I got home, I made sure to tell a friend about the cabin, where it was, what happened. I didn't want to keep it to myself. I knew someone might want to check the place out or at least be warned. I never went back. The woods hold many secrets, but some are best left undisturbed. The cabin was real, the sounds were real, and the footprints were real. But the thing pushing down trees and watching me from the dark, that's a story I'll carry with me forever. A reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or legends, but the wild, untamed parts of nature, and the people or animals who live there, unseen and waiting. I learned that night and in the days after, solitude can be a double-edged sword. It brings peace, but it also brings vulnerability. And when you're alone in the woods, the sky was a dull gray when I arrived at the cabin, nestled deep in the woods where the road ended and only dirt paths remained. I'd chosen this spot for the quiet, away from the noise and rush of the city, looking forward to a week of solitude. The forest stretched out all around, tall pine trees standing close together like silent guards. The smell of wet earth and pine needles filled the air, a scent I always found comforting. The gravel driveway was rough under my tires, small stones crunching as I pulled up near the weathered wooden cabin. The cabin looked older than I expected from the photos I saw online. Its dark brown logs were worn by years of rain and sun, with patches of moss growing in the corners where the roof met the walls. The windows were small and grimy, reflecting little light. A stone chimney jutted up from one side, stained black near the top. I grabbed my bags and headed inside, the door creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and dust, the air cool and heavy. The floorboards groaned underfoot as I moved through the small living room toward the kitchen. I set down my things and pulled open the cupboards, finding some basic cooking utensils and a rusty old kettle. No electricity or running water here. The cabin was off-grid, exactly what I wanted. I lit the gas stove with a match and boiled some water for tea. The tiny flames flickered in the dim light, shadows stretching long on the rough wooden walls. The only source of light came from the windows, but the overcast sky outside kept things muted and gray. I noticed spider webs in the corners of the ceiling and a layer of dust covering the shelves. This place hadn't seen visitors in a while. I unpacked my supplies: canned food, dry pasta, some fresh vegetables, and a few tools I thought I might need for repairs or emergencies. The cabin was simple, with one bedroom and a small bathroom where a hand pump was attached to a barrel outside to collect rainwater. The bed was a wooden frame with a thin mattress covered in a faded quilt. It looked uncomfortable, but I didn't plan to spend much time there except to sleep. I set my alarm clock, though I wasn't sure if it would work without batteries. I had a flashlight and extra batteries packed just in case. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches scratching softly against the roof. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the occasional call of a crow or the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I walked around the cabin, inspecting the perimeter. The wood siding showed signs of rot near the bottom in places, and some of the nails had come loose. I made a mental note to check the roof for leaks and to clear the gutters of leaves and pine needles. The ground was muddy from recent rain, and the path leading to a nearby stream was slippery. That first night was cold. I stacked some dry logs in the fireplace and managed to get a fire going after several attempts. The crackling flames filled the room with warmth and flickering light, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I sat in an old armchair, the leather cracked and worn, and sipped my tea while listening to the sounds outside. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves seemed louder in the stillness, and I found myself glancing toward the windows more than once. I kept the curtains partly drawn, though I knew there was no one out there. Sleep didn't come easily. The unfamiliar creaks and groans of the cabin made me tense. The wind howled softly, slipping through gaps in the wood and whistling around the eaves. Every now and then, the floor beneath the stairs would emit a sudden sharp creak, like a footstep. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe an animal outside. But my heart kept beating faster, and I stayed awake for hours, staring into the dark corners of the room. Morning came slowly. I opened the curtains and let in what little daylight there was. The forest outside looked damp and misty, the fog hanging low between the trees. I pulled on my boots and went to the stream I'd spotted the day before. The water was cold and clear, rushing over smooth stones with a quiet murmur. I filled a bottle and drank deeply. The smell of wet moss and pine was fresh and clean, a sharp contrast to the stale air inside the cabin. I picked up some fallen branches nearby, thinking they might come in handy for the fire. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. Mornings were for gathering firewood, checking the water barrel, and cooking simple meals. Afternoons I spent exploring the surrounding woods, always staying close enough to find my way back. The forest was dense, the ground uneven and covered in thick layers of fallen needles and leaves. I found animal tracks on the trails, deer, rabbits, and the occasional raccoon. One day, I spotted the tracks of a larger animal, maybe a coyote or a wild dog. It made me cautious but didn't scare me. I kept my knife close and stayed alert. Inside the cabin, I fixed a few things. I tightened loose boards on the porch, sealed some gaps around the windows with strips of cloth, and cleaned out the gutters. I found an old first aid kit under the sink, half expired but still useful. My phone had no signal, but I brought a small radio that worked on batteries, mainly to listen to the weather reports. The forecast was for more rain over the next few days, so I made sure to keep the firewood dry and the windows sealed tight. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed something odd. The cabin door, which I had locked firmly earlier that day, was slightly ajar. My stomach tightened. I was sure I had locked it. I checked the latch and it clicked shut, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I double-checked the windows and secured them with wooden bars I found in the shed outside. Maybe the wind had blown the door open, or maybe I hadn't locked it properly in the first place. I told myself it was nothing. That night, the noises were worse. The wind was stronger, rattling the windows and shaking the branches against the walls. Somewhere outside, a tree limb snapped sharply. The fire in the fireplace sputtered and dimmed, the smoke curling up the chimney in thin wisps. I kept the flashlight nearby and stayed alert. The The creaks and groans of the cabin felt louder than ever, and the silence in between was tense and thick. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to focus on the firelight rather than the dark shadows that seemed to gather in the corners. The next day, I found more signs something wasn't right. Near the edge of the clearing around the cabin, there were footprints, fresh ones, not mine. They were large and messy, pressed deep into the muddy earth. They circled around the back of the cabin and disappeared into the trees. My heart raced as I traced the prints with my eyes. Whoever or whatever had made them had been here recently. I checked my supplies and found the knife missing from where I had left it on the kitchen table. It wasn't a small thing to lose by accident. I searched the cabin carefully but found no sign of forced entry besides the door left open the night before. The locks hadn't been broken. The windows were all intact. It was as if someone had slipped in and out quietly, taking the knife and leaving the footprints. I felt a chill that wasn't from the cold air. I made a quick meal and ate with my back against the wall, watching the door and windows. Every rustle outside made me jump. I knew I couldn't just stay and wait for whatever had come here to return. I packed my bags quickly, checked the map, and planned a route back to the main road. The sun was setting again, and the forest was darkening fast. I grabbed the flashlight, made sure my phone was off to save battery, and locked the door behind me as best I could. I took a deep breath and stepped out onto the porch. The woods were alive with sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals scurrying through the underbrush. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, making the path nearly invisible. I held the flashlight low, trying to keep the beam steady on the narrow trail. The footprints were still visible in the mud, but now they were deeper and more frequent. I kept moving, telling myself the way out was only a few miles. I had to keep calm. After about an hour of walking, I heard something behind me. At first, it was just a faint crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. I stopped and held my breath, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, slow and deliberate. I turned around slowly, shining the flashlight through the trees, but saw nothing. My heart pounded louder in my chest. I started walking faster, my footsteps crunching loudly on the dry leaves. The noise followed me, matching my pace, sometimes stopping and starting, like whoever it was trying to stay hidden but still close. I didn't dare look back again. I focused on the trail, the way the trees thinned out ahead, promising the end of the woods. The flashlight's beam flickered once, then went out, leaving me in almost complete darkness. I fumbled with the batteries, my hands shaking. After what felt like forever, the light came back on. Finally, the trees opened up to the edge of a gravel road. I ran toward the streetlight at the corner, relief flooding me. A car was parked nearby. My neighbor from the next cabin over, someone I hadn't met but knew from the community messages. I called out, waving my arms, and they spotted me quickly. They helped me back to their place where I could call for a ride. The police came. I had been looking forward to getting away for a while. Things in the city were wearing me down. Long days, too much noise, and the same daily routine that made the weeks blur together. I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere off the map where I didn't have to think about anything for a few days. I found this listing online, some private rental way up north in the Adirondacks. It wasn't even on one of the big vacation sites, just a random forum post that linked to a smaller rental website. It had pictures of this old wooden cabin surrounded by trees, with a dirt trail leading in, no neighbors, no internet, and barely a cell signal. That's exactly what I was looking for. I booked it for 5 days and took a week off work. I told a couple friends where I'd be, left my place in the early morning, and drove upstate with my car full of supplies. Cans, water, flashlight batteries, propane for a small stove, extra fuel, my sleeping bag, clothes, tools, and even a small hatchet. I didn't want to rely on anything being up there. From the way the guy described it in the listing, the cabin hadn't been used in months. The road up was mostly paved until the last 20 or so miles. Then it was gravel, then dirt. I kept having to slow down for potholes and fallen branches. No houses, no stores, no signs. Eventually, I came to a fork in the road with a faded wooden arrow nailed to a tree. The hand-painted sign just said, Cabin 3. I followed that trail for another 10 minutes, the trees getting tighter around the car. It felt like the forest was swallowing me up. I saw the cabin just as I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake. It was small but solid looking, weathered wood siding, a steep metal roof with some rust on it, and a small porch with 2 old chairs. A chimney poked out of the roof, though I didn't plan to use the fireplace. I parked beside it on the flattened dirt area and killed the engine. The silence hit me right away. No traffic, no people, just wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the old wood in the cabin. I unlocked the front door with the key the owner had mailed me. Inside, it smelled dry and dusty, but not moldy. One big room with a twin-sized bed on one side, a small kitchenette with an old gas stove, and a round table with 2 chairs. There was a metal wood stove in the corner for heat, and a single window in the front. No bathroom. There was an outhouse about 30 feet away into the woods. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the walls were rough and unpainted. It was basic, but it was what I wanted. I spent the first couple of hours unpacking and cleaning. The place had mouse droppings in the corners and a couple of dead spiders on the windowsill. I wiped things down, swept out the dust, and checked the stove to make sure it worked. The propane line seemed fine. I cracked open a few windows to air it out and sat on the porch drinking water, watching the sun drift lower through the trees. Felt peaceful, disconnected. I hadn't felt like that in months. The first night was cold, but I had packed thermals and my sleeping bag was rated for below freezing. I made a small dinner on the stove, then read for a bit by flashlight until my eyes got heavy. I could hear things outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling, maybe a raccoon or 2, but nothing out of the ordinary. I wasn't scared, just aware of how far I was from anyone else. The next morning, I woke up early and made coffee. The quiet was different this time, still there but heavier somehow. I walked around the cabin, just exploring. The trail behind it led to a small creek maybe 100 yards away. The water was clear and fast, cutting through rocks and fallen branches. I spent the day walking and resting, making a small fire pit beside the cabin, and chopping some wood from fallen limbs. I didn't bring any alcohol or anything to distract myself. I just wanted the quiet. But that night something felt wrong. I had gone to sleep a little after 10, bundled up in the bag, the wind outside calm. I woke up maybe 2 hours later, sweating. Not because I was hot. Something had jolted me awake. I stayed still for a moment, listening. It was too quiet. No wind, no rustling, just a heavy stillness pressing against the walls. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on. The room looked normal, but then I saw something. Near the window on the inside ledge were 2 smudges, small, like from fingers. They hadn't been there when I cleaned earlier. I got up and looked closer. They were faint, but real. 2 marks, about an inch apart, as if someone had leaned a hand against the glass. I stood there staring at them, trying to make sense of it. I walked outside with my flashlight, shining it across the dirt around the cabin. No footprints, no signs of anything. Maybe it had been me earlier. Maybe I'd touched the glass without thinking. I told myself that and went back to bed. But I didn't sleep much after that. I kept the flashlight close and listened for every small sound. The next day, I tried to shake it off. Went down to the creek, washed my face, walked deeper into the woods along the trail. I found an old tree stand, probably left by hunters years ago. The metal rusted and the ladder mostly broken. I didn't climb it, just marked it in my head as a landmark. I stayed out until late afternoon. When I got back, the sun was already behind the trees. The cabin looked darker than usual. I stepped up onto the porch and noticed the door wasn't fully closed. I stopped. I knew I'd locked it. I always locked it, even though no one was supposed to be around. I opened it slowly, holding the flashlight like a weapon even though it was still light out. Inside looked the same at first glance, but something was off. One of the chairs was turned slightly. A fork was on the floor by the kitchenette. My backpack, which I'd left on the table, was now on the bed. I searched the cabin from top to bottom, looked under the bed, checked the closet beside the door, even opened the tiny hatch to the attic space under the roof. Nothing. No one. I walked around the outside, checked the bushes, the edge of the woods. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of place. I even checked the outhouse. Empty. I sat on the porch for a long time, heart racing, eyes scanning the trees. I told myself maybe a raccoon got in, maybe I forgot to lock it, maybe it was just my mind messing with me from being alone too long. But I knew that wasn't it. Someone had been inside. That night I barely slept. I kept a hatchet by the bed and slept with my boots on. I didn't hear anything, but when I woke up, one of the porch chairs was turned facing the woods. I hadn't touched those chairs since the first day. I wanted to leave, but the car wouldn't start. I turned the key and it just clicked. Dead battery. I tried the lights, nothing. I checked under the hood, but I didn't know much about engines. The cables looked fine. The battery wasn't that old. I had jumper cables, but no second vehicle. No signal on my phone either. I walked up the road for maybe a mile, holding the phone above my head. Still nothing. So I went back. I figured I'd just wait it out, pack my things, and try the car again in the morning. Maybe the cold had drained the battery. Maybe it needed time. I didn't want to panic yet. That night was the worst. I heard it just after midnight. A noise outside, not an animal. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching the dry leaves behind the cabin. I sat up fast, grabbed the flashlight and hatchet, and moved to the window. I shut off the light and waited, eyes adjusting to the moonlight. A figure moved between the trees. Not fast, just walking, back and forth, staying in the shadows, like they knew where the moonlight hit. I couldn't make out a face, just a shape. I stayed there for maybe an hour, frozen, watching. They didn't come closer, just moved in and out of sight, like they were circling. Eventually, I stopped hearing the footsteps. I stayed awake until the sky turned gray. I opened the door slowly and checked around. No one, but this time I found something. A piece of cloth caught on the corner of the woodpile behind the cabin. It was dark blue, frayed at the edges, like from an old jacket. I took it and put it in my backpack. I didn't know why. I just didn't want to leave it behind. The car started that morning, just like that, turned over on the first try. I didn't waste time. I loaded my gear in 10 minutes and drove out without even looking back at the cabin. I didn't feel safe until I saw pavement again. When I got home, I looked up that listing again. It was gone. The entire site was offline. I tried to trace the email confirmation I'd gotten when I booked it, but it bounced back. No phone number, no contact, like it had never existed. A few days later, I went through my backpack to unpack and found the piece of cloth again. It was stuffed in the bottom where I'd forgotten about it, but now it smelled like smoke. Not strong, just faint, like burnt wood. I never figured out who was out there or what they wanted. I checked news reports, forums, everything I could. Nothing. No missing person reports, no arrests, no break-ins in that area. But I think about it sometimes, how isolated that place was. How easy it would be for someone to watch from the trees, to move between the shadows, to wait. I rented the cabin because I needed to get away from the city. Things had been stacking up on me for months. Work deadlines, relationship stress, constant noise, and just that general feeling like you're being crushed under everything and there's no space to breathe. I found the cabin on a listing site. It wasn't flashy or modern. It looked plain, older, like it had been there for decades without any big renovations. That's what I wanted: quiet, simple, and as far from other people as possible. The owner listed it as a primitive hunter's cabin tucked in a valley in the northern part of Vermont, with no cell service and no internet. It was about a 20-minute drive from the nearest paved road, surrounded by trees on all sides. Sounded perfect. I packed up for 5 nights. Brought dry food, a cooler of perishables, some basic tools, a flashlight, a camp stove, a sleeping bag, a water filter, and a few books I'd been meaning to read. I had no interest in hiking or sightseeing. I just wanted to be still for a while. The drive up took most of the day. The last few miles were slow going, with a narrow dirt road winding through dense trees, barely wide enough for my car. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the ridge. The cabin looked like the pictures: wooden walls dark from age, a sloped metal roof, small windows, and a porch with a single old chair. There were pine needles and leaves all over the steps. The air smelled like sap and damp dirt. Inside, it was one room: a cot against the wall with a wool blanket folded neatly on top, a small wood stove in one corner with a few logs stacked beside it, a chipped table with 2 chairs, a shelf with a few mismatched dishes. No electricity, no running water. There was a dry toilet about 20 yards behind the cabin and a small spring nearby that the owner said was safe to drink from with a filter. I set my bag down, rolled out my sleeping bag, and cracked open a can of soup. The quiet was total. It wasn't just the absence of traffic or talking or phones buzzing. It was that deep, heavy silence that you only find in woods far away from anything. I sat outside on the steps with the soup and listened to the breeze moving through the trees and some small animals shuffling in the leaves nearby. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. No headlights flashing across the ceiling. No distant sirens. Just the faint creak of the trees and the soft pop of the cooling stovepipe. I woke up just after sunrise to birds calling and a bit of fog curling between the trees. I made coffee on the camp stove and sat on the porch with a book. It was exactly what I needed. The first 2 days were uneventful, just peaceful. I read, wrote a little in a notebook, made simple meals, walked around the cabin area. There was an old overgrown trail behind the cabin, barely visible under the ferns and brush, and I followed it a few times, just far enough to stretch my legs. I didn't see another person or even signs of people. No planes overhead, no distant sounds of trucks or chainsaws or dogs. I didn't even see any deer or squirrels, which I thought was strange, but didn't think too much about it. I figured maybe the area was just quiet like that. It was the 3rd night when I started feeling off. Not scared exactly, but unsettled. I was lying in the cot, trying to fall asleep, and I thought I heard a rustle outside. Not the normal kind of rustle that wind makes in branches. This was lower, steadier, like footsteps through dry leaves. I held still, breathing shallow, and listened. It stopped. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or something similar and rolled over. But then I noticed something I hadn't before. The cabin wasn't completely dark. There was the faintest bit of light coming in through one of the windows, like the moonlight was being blocked or filtered. I got up, went to the window slowly, and looked out. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed something just at the edge of the trees, darker than the rest of the forest. It wasn't moving. I stared for a long time, but the shape didn't shift or come closer. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a tree or a shadow, something that looked strange only because I was half asleep. In the morning, I went outside and checked the area. There were no tracks, no broken branches, nothing, but the shape had been real enough to make my heart race. I walked a little farther down the slope behind the cabin, just looking around, and I found something I hadn't seen before. About 50 yards down, there was an old pile of boards and rusted metal half buried in leaves. It looked like the remains of a collapsed shed. Maybe it had been another cabin at some point. I walked around it carefully, but didn't see anything that stood out, just rot and rust. Back at the cabin, I tried to settle back into the quiet, made breakfast, cleaned up, read, stretched, wrote a little. But the feeling didn't go away. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound outside seemed sharper, closer. I started noticing little things I hadn't paid attention to before. How the leaves in one spot beside the cabin looked disturbed, or how the air felt too still at times, like it was waiting. That night, I double-checked the door latch and brought the flashlight into the cot with me. I didn't fall asleep easily. Every creak felt louder. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I woke up again in total darkness to the sound of something brushing against the outside wall. I sat up fast, heart hammering, and held my breath. The sound came again, slow and steady, not a branch in the wind. It was too rhythmic, like a hand or a body sliding along the logs. Then silence. I didn't move. I stayed like that for maybe half an hour, barely blinking. Eventually, the sound didn't return, and I must have drifted off sitting upright. In the morning, I went outside with the flashlight still in my hand. I walked the perimeter of the cabin slowly. On the back wall, just under the window near the cot, there were faint marks in the dirt. Not boot prints exactly, more like shallow impressions. Could have been from an animal, I told myself. I told myself that a lot that day, but I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been there, that they were still close. I didn't have cell signal, no way to call out. I could have driven back out, but it felt like giving up. I told myself I only had 2 nights left. I could handle 2 more nights. That 4th day, I kept a knife on my belt, just a small one from my pack, but it made me feel a little better. I tried to go about the day like normal, collecting firewood, boiling water, sitting outside for a while, but I kept scanning the trees. Couldn't relax. I noticed more small things. A broken pine branch that hadn't been broken the day before. A boot-sized scuff in the mud near the old trail. I couldn't say for sure if they were new, but it felt like they were. I decided to go back down to the old shed ruin before dark. I wanted to be sure there wasn't someone sleeping there or stashing stuff. I brought the flashlight and the knife and moved slowly. When I got there, I walked the area carefully. Same as before, just broken wood, rusted nails, and piles of leaves. But this time, I noticed something buried deeper, a corner of what looked like plastic. I dug around it with a stick until I pulled it loose. It was a tarp, green and stiff with age. Underneath it were more boards, some with saw marks, and an old metal can. Nothing that said someone had been there recently, but the tarp didn't look more than a few years old. It didn't feel right. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the cot with the flashlight in my hand and my ears straining for any sound. For a long time, nothing. Then, just past midnight, I heard something tap the wall near my head. Just once. Then again, softer. Then silence. I didn't move. The flashlight beam wavered in my shaking hand. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. When it got light enough outside, I packed everything up. Food, clothes, stove. I didn't make breakfast. I shoved everything into the bags and loaded the car. I planned to leave early anyway. I told myself just a day early. That was all. As I backed out of the clearing and started the slow drive down the dirt road, I kept checking the rear view. I didn't see anything, but just as I turned onto the paved road, I glanced at the passenger seat and noticed something I hadn't put there. It was a single pine cone sitting on top of my folded jacket. I hadn't collected any pine cones. I hadn't brought one in. I don't know how it got there. I stopped the car, picked it up, and threw it into the woods. My heart was pounding again. I drove all the way home with the windows cracked and the music loud, just to feel like I was somewhere real again. I didn't go back. I didn't leave a review on the site. I didn't message the owner. For weeks after, I kept checking over my shoulder at home, checking my locks twice, listening for sounds outside that didn't belong. I didn't find anything. Nothing happened, but the feeling didn't go away. It still hasn't completely. There was someone out there. I know it. Watching. Waiting. Maybe they didn't want to hurt me. Maybe they were just curious. But they were there, and they knew I was alone. And quiet places don't always mean safe places. I learned that out there, and I never want to learn it again. I didn't plan to stay in that cabin alone. Originally, it was supposed to be a weekend getaway with my cousin Dan, a kind of quiet break from everything back home. We'd both been dealing with a lot, work stress, family drama, the usual things that stack up when you're not paying attention. He found the cabin on some rental site, tucked in a wooded patch near a lake about 4 hours outside of Kansas City. The photos made it look peaceful. Simple wood frame, tin roof, deck out front, dense trees in every direction. It was owned by some older guy who had it built in the early 90s. Said he barely used it anymore but kept it in decent shape. Dan canceled the morning we were supposed to drive out. Some last-minute emergency with his girlfriend. He said I should still go, that it might do me some good. I didn't want to waste the time off, and the thought of sitting in total quiet for a few days started to sound better the more I thought about it. So I went by myself. It was late October, and the trees were turning every shade of yellow, orange, and brown. The drive took longer than I expected because I kept stopping to get snacks and fuel, and then I got a little turned around the last 20 miles. The roads weren't marked well, and I lost cell signal somewhere after I passed a rusted-out bus that looked like it hadn't moved in decades. Eventually, I found the narrow gravel path that led back through the trees. It wound around for maybe a mile, and then the cabin came into view, sitting right near the edge of a small lake. There was a fire pit made out of mismatched stones out front, and an old aluminum canoe leaning against one side of the cabin. The front door stuck when I tried to open it, but after a bit of shoving, it popped loose. Inside was about what I expected. A small kitchen with a gas stove, a fridge humming quietly, a table with 2 chairs, and a living room with a lumpy couch and a couple of folded wool blankets. There was a loft above with a mattress on the floor and a single window that looked out over the woods behind the place. The bathroom was tiny, but it had hot water and decent water pressure, which was all I really cared about. The first evening was calm. I unpacked, made a sandwich, and sat out on the little porch with a beer in hand as the sun dropped below the trees. It got dark fast out there. No streetlights, no house lights in the distance, just total blackness except for the stars. I brought a small camping lantern and used it to read a paperback until I got tired. Then I climbed up to the loft, lay on the old mattress, and listened to the crickets and frogs outside. I slept fine. It was the next day when I noticed something strange. I'd gone for a walk around the lake, taking slow steps and just trying to enjoy the quiet. On the far side of the water, maybe 200 yards from the cabin, I found what looked like an old shed, half covered in moss and leaned slightly to one side. The door was padlocked, and a tarp covered part of the roof. A few empty gas cans sat off to the side, and the grass around it had been flattened like someone had walked through there often. I didn't think much of it. Maybe the owner stored tools in there or used it as a backup supply shed. I walked back to the cabin and read most of the afternoon. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, just a soft, rhythmic scraping. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure it out. It was coming from outside, maybe the side of the cabin. I figured it might be a raccoon or a branch tapping against the siding. After about 10 minutes, it stopped, and I went back to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check for any signs of an animal. I didn't see anything right away, but then I noticed fresh scuff marks in the dirt near the back wall, like something had been dragged. The marks didn't go far, just a few feet before vanishing into the leaves. It didn't look like a paw print or shoe tread, just smooth lines like something heavy had been pulled across the ground. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe the wind knocked over something that had since rolled into the brush. Maybe deer passed through. I tried not to let it get in my head. Later that day, while gathering firewood a bit deeper in the woods, I found a small pile of clothes. At first, I thought someone dumped laundry there, but when I looked closer, I saw they were stiff from rain and sun. Jeans, a flannel shirt, even socks and underwear. No wallet, no ID. They were folded loosely, as if someone had taken them off and set them down. The weird part was how clean they looked, considering they were in the woods. No rips, no animal bites, no stains beyond what you'd expect from sitting outside. I left them where they were and walked back a bit faster than usual. I didn't say anything out loud, but my brain wouldn't let it go. I kept thinking, who just takes off all their clothes in the middle of the woods? And why fold them? I barely slept that night. The noises came back, scraping again, and something that sounded like a low thump, like someone placing a heavy box down on a wooden floor. It was too regular to be an animal. Every few seconds, like a slow heartbeat. It stopped after a while, but not before I started sweating under the blanket. I stayed inside most of the next day. I made coffee, read the same paragraph in my book about 10 times, and kept looking out the windows. I didn't even want to go to the shed or back toward the pile of clothes. I started to feel like someone else was out there, watching. I catch myself staring out at the trees and then snap out of it like I'd been in a trance. Nothing ever moved, but I felt something. Not a ghost or anything, just presence. Like how you know someone's behind you even if they don't say anything. Later that afternoon, I finally decided to go down to the shed. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd find a trail cam or a generator or something that explained the noises. When I got there, the padlock was gone. The door was closed but slightly off its hinge, just enough that it rocked a little in the breeze. Inside, it was mostly empty. A few crates, an old water jug, and a rusted toolbox on a shelf. But there was also a sleeping bag unrolled on the floor, and a pile of snack wrappers next to it, protein bars, trail mix packets, an empty can of beans. They weren't old. The wrappers weren't faded or wet. Someone had been sleeping in there. Recently. I backed out slowly, closed the door, and didn't touch anything. I walked quickly, not running but close to it. My heart was pounding by the time I got back to the cabin. I locked the front door, then pushed a chair under the knob. I even stacked a few pots in front of the back door so I'd hear if it opened. That night, the noises were louder. Not just scraping now, but soft footsteps on the porch. They moved slowly, like someone testing the boards. Then the front doorknob rattled. Not hard, not like someone trying to break in. Just enough to check if it was locked. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then disappeared. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I packed everything. I was done. I didn't care if I lost the deposit or if the owner was pissed. I shoved everything in my duffel and carried it to the car in one trip. The gravel road seemed longer on the way out. I kept checking the rearview mirror like an idiot, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees. When I got back home, I didn't tell anyone much, just that the cabin was boring and I wanted to come back early. But it stuck with me. A few weeks later, I tried to look up the listing again to see if anyone else had mentioned weird stuff in the reviews. The listing was gone. I searched the name of the guy who owned it. Nothing. I tried the coordinates I had written down from the directions. No results. It was like the place never existed online. But I know what I saw. Someone was living out there. Someone who didn't want to be found. And I think I got too close. They didn't attack or say anything. They didn't need to. They just let me know they were there, and that was enough. I never went back, and I never will. But sometimes when I'm walking through woods or driving past a stretch of trees, I get that same feeling. Like someone's there, just out of sight, standing still and watching. And I wonder how long they've been doing it, and how many people went to that cabin before me and never made it out. I had been working in the city non-stop for almost 9 months before I finally burned out. It was like one morning I just woke up, stared at my computer screen, and couldn't move. Not from pain or sickness, but like something in me just shut down. I told my boss I needed time off, and to my surprise, she didn't argue. She just looked at me and nodded. I guess I wasn't hiding the exhaustion as well as I thought. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my friends. I just packed up and left. I booked a small cabin through one of those vacation rental sites. It was deep in the woods in northern Minnesota, about 4 hours north of Duluth. The listing said it was on private land with a mile-long driveway and no neighbors for at least 5 miles in any direction. That sounded perfect. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just peace, quiet, and space to breathe again. The pictures showed a simple wooden cabin with a tin roof, a small porch, and a fire pit out front. It had solar panels for basic electricity, a wood stove for heat, and no Wi-Fi. That was exactly what I wanted. I got there in the early afternoon on a cloudy Thursday in late September. The leaves had just started changing. Bright orange and red speckled the forest around me as I drove down the long dirt path leading to the cabin. The place looked exactly like the pictures. Tiny, old but well-kept, with a split log pile stacked up neatly along the side. I parked and stepped out into a kind of silence I hadn't heard in years. No cars, no voices, not even the hum of power lines. Just wind moving through trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. Inside, the cabin smelled like cedar and old books. The interior was small, one room with a bed, a table, a small kitchen area with a propane stove, and the wood stove in the corner. There was a bathroom with a composting toilet and a gravity-fed shower setup, which I figured I'd only use if I absolutely had to. I spent the rest of that day unpacking and walking around the land. There were animal trails through the woods, probably deer or foxes, maybe even a bear. I didn't mind. The first 2 days were exactly what I hoped for. I read, cooked simple meals, took naps. I didn't see another human being, not even a plane in the sky. I started to feel like I could think clearly again. I slept deeply at night with the windows open and the sound of wind in the trees. On the third night, I heard something strange. I had gone to bed around 10 after putting a few more logs in the stove. I was drifting off when I heard a knock. Not on the door, but a sharp, distinct clack against the side of the cabin. It came from the back where the forest came right up to the wall. I froze, listening. It happened again, just once, like someone tapping on the outside wall with a rock or a stick. I got up and went to the window, but it was too dark to see anything. I turned on the small exterior floodlight by the porch. The back wall had no windows. I grabbed the flashlight, stepped onto the porch, and walked around the cabin. My boots crunched on fallen leaves. I scanned the woods, the ground, the side of the cabin. Nothing. No animals, no branches out of place, no signs of anything. I went back inside, locked the door even though it felt silly, and went to bed. I didn't hear anything else that night. The next morning, I went to the back of the cabin to look around in the daylight. There were no marks on the wall, no tracks. I tried to brush it off as a tree branch knocked loose in the wind, maybe something falling from above. But the thing was, it hadn't been windy. The trees were still. I kept thinking about how clear that sound was. It had been deliberate, like someone tapping. That day, I went for a longer hike, trying to shake the unease. I followed a game trail that led down a shallow hill, through a stand of birch, and into a small hollow where there was an overgrown hunting blind made of rotting plywood. I didn't stay long. Something about that spot felt off. It was colder, damper. The light didn't hit it the same way. I turned around and made my way back up the hill. That night, I brought some of the split logs inside before it got dark. I didn't want to go out at night again. I cooked dinner, read for a while, then lay in bed watching the shadows of tree branches sway on the ceiling. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't from the back wall. It was from the porch. The unmistakable sound of a footstep on the wood. Just one. Then nothing. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I held my breath and listened. Another step, slow, heavy. Not an animal. Not a raccoon or fox. It was the sound of a person trying to move quietly. I didn't have a gun. All I had was a heavy iron fire poker and a knife I used for cooking. I grabbed both and moved slowly toward the front door. The porch light was off. I hadn't turned it on. I looked through the small window but couldn't see anything. I stayed still, every muscle tense. The footsteps stopped. After about 20 minutes, I finally opened the door a crack and flipped on the light. The porch was empty. The ground was covered in dry leaves. But there were no tracks, no signs anyone had stood there. I barely slept that night. The next day, I seriously considered leaving. I even packed some of my things, but I talked myself down. Maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by too much isolation. Maybe I had heard a deer, or even my own movement in the bed. The woods play tricks on people. I unpacked and tried to go about my day like normal, but the feeling didn't go away. It got worse. I kept noticing little things that seemed off. A piece of firewood that had been moved from the stack. A cup I could have sworn I left on the table now sitting by the sink. The back door, barely used, had fresh dirt on the threshold. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. On the 6th night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in a chair by the window with the fire poker across my lap and the lights off. I waited. At 1:17 a.m., I saw movement. A dark figure passed just at the edge of the trees, moving slowly toward the cabin. I didn't breathe. It stopped about 15 feet from the porch. Just stood there. I could barely see it, but the shape was unmistakable, human. No flashlight, no sound. Just watching. It stayed there for almost half an hour, not moving. Then it backed up into the trees and was gone. I slept during the day after that, locked the doors, and stayed awake all night. The next few nights passed the same way. Movement in the trees, sometimes closer. Once I heard breathing just outside the window. I was afraid to turn on the lights. I didn't want whoever it was to know I saw them. The worst was the 8th night. It was raining and I thought maybe they wouldn't come. Around 3 a.m., I heard the doorknob rattle. Slow, deliberate. Then a sharp knock, just like the first night, followed by silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, muscles locked, staring at the door. I knew someone had been touching it. I left the next morning, packed everything in 20 minutes, didn't even bother folding clothes. I drove away without looking back. The road was slick, the leaves heavy with rain, but I didn't stop. When I got to the gas station 2 hours away, I used their Wi-Fi to check the property listing. It had been removed. I tried to contact the owner. The number was disconnected. Out of curiosity, I searched the land records for the area. The property had belonged to a man named Gerald Quist. He went missing in 2002. His truck was found on the property, but his body was never recovered. The land had sat vacant for almost 15 years before someone tried to rent it out as a vacation spot. I told the sheriff's office everything when I got home. They filed a report but said they couldn't do anything without more evidence. The property was too remote, and no crime had technically occurred. It's been almost a year now. I still think about it. I don't go camping anymore. I don't even like being home alone. I installed cameras, motion lights, new locks. I check them every night before I sleep. Whatever was out there didn't follow me, but I don't think I was the first person they watched in that cabin. And I'm afraid I won't be the last. I had been feeling overwhelmed for months. Between my job at the warehouse, the never-ending overtime, and the buzzing city life, I felt like I was slowly being drained dry. I hadn't taken any time off in almost 2 years, and it had finally caught up to me. I didn't want to fly anywhere, didn't want a beach or some hotel. I just needed silence. I needed space. That's how I ended up booking a remote cabin up in Vermont for a week. It wasn't listed on Airbnb or any big rental site. A guy I used to work with years ago had shared it with me, said his uncle owned a place way up in the mountains near the Canadian border, middle of nowhere. No neighbors, no traffic, no cell service. Sounded perfect. I packed light, just clothes, my sleeping bag, canned food, a few books, and my phone for offline music. I also brought a cheap battery-powered radio and a hunting knife I'd kept from my dad's stuff. The drive from Boston took about 6 hours, but once I passed the last small town, the landscape completely changed. The trees grew denser, the road narrowed, and everything felt untouched. I followed the directions exactly. It was a rough dirt road for the last few miles, barely wide enough for my car, and the woods started feeling almost claustrophobic. But then, right where the old map sketch said it would be, the cabin came into view. It was small, just one floor, made of old, weathered wood with a tin roof. There was a porch with a rotting rocking chair, and a small shed off to the side, partly hidden by trees. The windows were clouded with age. It looked like no one had been there for a while. I parked, killed the engine, and sat for a moment with the windows down. No wind, no traffic, no distant hum of anything. Just birds and the occasional rustling of leaves. I let myself breathe for the first time in weeks. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and dust. There was a small kitchen area, a living room with a wood stove, and a tiny bedroom in the back with a creaky bed frame. The water was from a hand pump outside, and the bathroom was an outhouse about 50 yards into the woods. There was no electricity except for a solar panel rigged to a battery, which barely powered a single overhead light. I didn't mind. It was exactly what I wanted. The first day was peaceful. I walked around the property, explored a bit of the forest surrounding the cabin, and cooked beans over a small propane stove. I sat on the porch until nightfall, watching the sky change color. There were no stars back in the city, but out here, the night sky looked endless. I fell asleep early, worn out in the best way. The next morning, I woke up around 6. I made instant coffee and took it outside. The fog sat low between the trees, and the quiet was deep. I heard a woodpecker tapping away somewhere. I walked around the cabin again, more out of habit than curiosity, and noticed something I hadn't the day before. Behind the shed, a faint trail cut through the woods. It wasn't wide or clear like a hiking path, but it was too clean to be natural. I figured it was probably used years ago and had just faded. I decided to follow it a bit after breakfast. The trail dipped down into a shallow ravine and curved up again on the other side. I didn't see any tracks or signs of animals, but I saw pieces of old fence nailed to trees and rusted metal half buried in the soil, probably remnants of an old property line. After about 30 minutes of slow walking, I came across an old wooden post sticking out of the ground with some kind of hook on it. Nearby was a flattened patch of ground surrounded by rocks in a circle, maybe an old fire pit or camp spot. I sat there for a bit before heading back. When I got to the cabin, I checked my phone out of habit even though I knew there was no signal. I put on a little music and made lunch. The rest of the day passed quietly. I read on the porch until dark and kept the door locked just because I always do. It was the third day that something started feeling off. I'd woken up with a slight headache, which wasn't too unusual, but when I walked around the property that morning, I noticed a few things I hadn't left that way. The lid to the water barrel outside had been taken off and set aside. I always closed it to keep bugs out. There were also fresh footprints in the dirt near the outhouse, boot prints, not mine. Mine were from sneakers, and I hadn't worn boots once since I got there. First, I tried to reason it out. Maybe animals? Maybe I had left the lid off and forgot? But the footprints were clear. Too heavy for an animal and too deep to be old. I followed them back into the woods a few yards, but they vanished into harder ground where I couldn't track them. That made me uneasy. The rest of the day I felt watched. I know how paranoid that sounds, but there was a stillness in the trees that didn't feel right. I stayed close to the cabin, kept the door locked, and left the hunting knife on the table. That night I slept light, waking up at every noise outside, every creak. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard a soft crunch on the leaves outside. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened, but it was dead silent. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I found the rocking chair on the porch was turned around, facing the woods. I had left it facing the cabin wall. I know I had. That wasn't something I'd mix up. I walked out into the woods and checked all around the cabin. No sign of anyone. No new footprints, nothing disturbed. But the trail behind the shed, it looked slightly more worn than it had a few days ago, like someone else had walked it. I spent that day pacing the cabin, constantly looking out the windows. I didn't leave except to get water. My stomach was tight. I kept trying to convince myself I was just freaking out from the isolation. I even considered driving home early, but I didn't want to feel like I'd let my mind get the best of me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lights off and sat in the living room with the knife in my hand. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like a branch snapping. Not an animal sound, not the wind. I crept to the window and looked out. Nothing but blackness. Then I saw the shape. Just past the trees, maybe 30 or 40 feet from the cabin, there was a figure, not moving, just standing. I could barely make out the outline, but it was definitely a person. I stood frozen for what felt like an hour. The figure didn't move. Eventually, I backed away from the window, locked the door again just to be sure, and sat in silence until the sun came up. When daylight finally broke, I went outside slowly, knife in hand. The figure was gone. I walked out to the trees where I thought it had been, and sure enough, there were boot prints in the dirt. Same size and shape as before. They led back into the woods right toward that faded trail. I made a decision then. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't just sit around waiting. I packed my bag, left most of my gear behind to travel light, and started down the trail with the knife on my belt and my flashlight in my hand. I walked for maybe 45 minutes, deeper than I had before. The forest got denser, the trees growing tighter together, branches low. Eventually, I reached a clearing. At the far edge of it, mostly hidden by brush, was a small structure. Not a cabin, more like a shack. Old, falling apart with a hole in the roof. I approached slowly. The door was hanging off the hinges. Inside was one small room. There was a rusty cot, a collapsed table, and shelves with old cans and plastic containers. A smell of rot and mold hung heavy. In the corner was a pile of clothing, dirty jackets, pants, boots. Too many for one person. There were also bones. Small animal bones, mostly, but they had been carefully stacked, arranged. not randomly tossed. That detail stuck with me. I checked around the outside of the shack and saw fresh prints, still damp from the night. Someone had been here recently, very recently. I didn't stay long. Something in my gut told me to get out of there. I made my way back to the cabin fast, constantly checking behind me. When I got back, I packed everything. I didn't even stop to eat. I threw my bags in the car and started the engine. The tires spun a little in the dirt before grabbing, and I drove back down that rough road without stopping. As I reached the main road and finally saw pavement again, my chest loosened for the first time in 2 days. I didn't stop driving until I was over an hour away, back near a town with people and lights. I got a room in a roadside motel and passed out for 12 straight hours. The next day, I called the guy who gave me the cabin info. I told him everything. He went quiet and then admitted something he hadn't told me before. That part of the woods had a bad reputation. Over the years, hunters and hikers had reported strange sightings, signs of people living out there, off the grid, but nothing provable. He thought it was just old stories. Said his uncle never stayed out there himself, just kept the cabin on the property because it was cheap to maintain. I never went back. I didn't even want my security deposit. I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the woods, standing still in the dark, watching. Whoever that was, they weren't passing through. That shack, the clothing, the stacked bones. Someone was living out there, watching the cabin. I was 33 when I decided to take a break from everything and rent a cabin deep in the woods of northern Colorado. Work had been eating away at me, and my days felt like the same loop over and over. I wasn't trying to find myself or anything dramatic like that. I just wanted to be somewhere quiet, away from people, where I could think and maybe breathe a little better. I found the cabin on a listing site that focused on remote getaways, and this one seemed perfect. It was about 20 minutes down an unpaved road, no neighbors, surrounded by thick trees and nothing else. The pictures showed a plain wooden cabin with a porch, a small fire pit in the back, and a view of the tree-covered valley below. I packed up my truck with enough food for 10 days, a couple of changes of clothes, tools, and basic gear just in case something broke. I brought a small generator, my phone, a portable charger, a radio, and a few books. I didn't plan on using the internet or anything like that. The place had no service anyway, which was part of the appeal. I wanted quiet, real quiet. The drive out was long and slow, especially the last part. The gravel road had ruts and rocks that forced me to crawl forward at a snail's pace. I followed the directions the host gave me, watching for a blue marker on a tree that was supposed to indicate the turnoff. After about half an hour of winding through the woods, I spotted the tree and turned left onto a narrow dirt trail. Branches scraped the sides of the truck. The trail got tighter, but finally opened into a small clearing with the cabin sitting dead center. It looked older than the pictures made it seem. The wood siding was faded and weathered, with some boards warped slightly from years of sun and snow. There was a small shed next to it, padlocked, and a stack of old firewood behind that. The porch creaked under my boots as I walked up. I unlocked the front door with the key the host had left in a combination box by the steps and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like dust and dry wood. It was a single large room with a small kitchen along one wall, a sitting area with a couch and a low coffee table, a table with 2 chairs by the window, and a bed tucked into the back corner. There was a narrow bathroom, just a toilet and a shower with a tiny water heater mounted to the wall. Everything worked, even the old propane stove and the tiny refrigerator. I opened the windows to let the air flow in and started unpacking. The first day passed slowly. I sat on the porch as the sun went down, listening to the wind in the trees and the occasional chirp of some bird or the rustling of a small animal. There were no cars, no voices, no cell pings, just pure silence. I cooked a can of stew, read for a while, and went to bed early. The second day was the same, peaceful. I hiked a little, explored the area, didn't go too far, just far enough to get a feel for the place. I marked trees with red tape as I went, just to make sure I could find my way back without issue. The forest was thick, but beautiful. The air smelled clean, filled with pine and the dry scent of dirt and bark. I came across an old deer trail and followed it until it disappeared into thicker underbrush. I didn't see another person or hear a single man-made sound all day. On the third morning, I noticed something odd. When I stepped outside, there were boot prints in the dirt near the fire pit. I hadn't made them. I wore hiking shoes, and these were larger, heavier treaded prints. At first, I thought maybe they were old, just brought out by the wind brushing off some of the topsoil. But they were fresh. The edges were clean, and the ground had been slightly damp from dew. I felt that little prick of awareness creep up the back of my neck, the way your body knows something before your brain can make sense of it. I looked around the clearing but saw nothing. No signs of anyone. No broken branches, no cigarette butts, no trash. Nothing. I told myself it could have been someone passing through. Maybe a hunter or hiker. But I didn't like it. I stayed outside most of that day, chopping firewood, keeping my ears open. I felt eyes on me more than once, though when I turned, there was nothing there, just trees and silence. That night, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. The front door had a deadbolt, and the windows had old latches, but I wedged sticks under each frame just to be sure. I pulled the curtains shut and kept a flashlight close. I left the generator off and used a battery lantern. The cabin made small sounds as it settled, groans in the wood, creaks from the roof. Every time I heard something unfamiliar, my heart jumped a little. I barely slept. The next morning, the prints were gone, wiped clean, but something was wrong. One of the logs I had chopped and stacked near the back corner was missing. Just one. It made no sense. I circled the cabin slowly, checking everything. The shed lock was untouched. No signs of break-in, but one log gone didn't sit right with me. It wasn't like an animal could carry it off. It was too heavy, too awkward. It had to be a person. I kept the hatchet with me the whole day after that. I stayed close to the cabin, only going into the trees to grab more kindling. I kept checking behind me. There was always that quiet tension in the air, like something was holding its breath. I started thinking about how far out I really was. No cell service, no neighbors. No one would hear me if I screamed. That night, I sat in the dark with the lantern off, listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside, slow, crunching the dirt and dead pine needles. They circled the cabin once, then stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I sat in the corner by the bed, the hatchet in my hand, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. After what felt like hours, the sound faded. I waited until dawn before moving. When light finally crept through the cracks in the curtains, I opened the front door and stepped out, careful, listening. The clearing was still, but nailed to the side of the cabin, just under the window, was the missing log. A hunting knife was jammed into it, just stuck in deep, left there. The knife was old and rusted, but the blade was still sharp. I pulled it out and held it. It didn't belong to me. That was the moment I knew this wasn't random. Someone was out there and they were watching me, playing with me. I needed to leave, but I also needed to be smart. I packed my things slowly, not rushing, not making it obvious. I put everything back in the truck, started the engine, and pulled away from the cabin without looking back. I made it halfway down the dirt trail before I saw the rope. It was stretched across the path, tied between two trees. A thick rope, the kind used for towing or climbing, positioned at chest height. If I had driven through it fast, it could have easily broken the windshield or worse. I stopped the truck and got out slowly. I looked around, heart pounding. Nothing. No one. Just trees. I cut the rope down with the old knife and drove on, this time much faster. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, and even then I didn't feel safe. I drove straight back into town, found the nearest motel, and checked in. I didn't tell anyone at the front desk what happened. I just wanted a bed, four walls, and a lock I trusted. The next morning, I reported the incident to the local sheriff. I told him everything I could remember, left out nothing. He listened carefully, nodded a lot, but in the end, all he said was that they'd send someone out to look. Probably a squatter or some survivalist. Said it happened sometimes in the deep woods. People who didn't want to be found. People who didn't like others in their territory. I never heard back. I never returned to the cabin. I left a review on the rental site but kept it vague. Said there were safety concerns and left it at that. I figured whoever was out there would still be there, and I didn't want anyone else to get the wrong idea and think the place was safe. It's been 2 years. I still think about it sometimes, usually when I'm in bed and the house is quiet. I still hear those footsteps in my memory, slow and steady outside the walls. I think about how close they came. I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. What was the plan? The knife in the log wasn't just a message, it was a warning. Or maybe it was an invitation. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I don't rent remote cabins. I don't look for silence the way I used to. There's something out there, not supernatural or cursed or any of that nonsense. Just something deeply human. Something dangerous and patient. I wasn't chosen. I was just unlucky enough to walk into their world. And next time, whoever does might not be as lucky as I was.